Good afternoon. According to Central European Time, and welcome on the 7th session of Genealogies of Memory Conference. Today's session bears the title Holocaust Memory, Diagnosing the Global Effect. The session aims at revising the recognition on the global memory of the Holocaust in 21st century. The memory was shifting increasingly since within the last 20-30 years. We will try to diagnose today the level, the range of its pluralization and universalization, as well as define possible risks, benefits, challenges resulting from that phenomenon. The session will also focus on national receptions, backlashes of global memory, taking under consideration especially Polish and German context, but also opening broader questions about the Eastern European memory in post-colonial frames. Before we start the academic discussion, let me share with you some logistic technical informations. So our session today, like always, consists of two parts. In first part, we have a keynote speech with our great Professor Daniel Levy. And then we have a second part, a panel with presentations. We will have 4 panelists today, and then we have our great commentator and commentaries from the commentator side, and then we have, of course, time for discussion. After the keynote speak, also we have a little time for discussion, and you are very much welcome to ask the questions, and you have few options, and I will remind you what kind of options we have. And between the first part and the second part, we have 15 minutes a long technical break. So what kind of options you have to ask the questions? Those who follow the transmission on YouTube or Facebook can address questions to the keynote speaker or presenters from panelists. And you are free to send your question by email to the address genealogies@enrs.eu. So this is our conference email. Once more time, genealogies@enrs.eu. And those who follow us on Zoom can ask questions directly via Q&A panel. And now I would like to welcome Professor Daniel Levy and introduce him a little and present his little biography. So Daniel Levy is a professor of sociology at Stony Brook University in New York. He is a political historical sociologist with a focus on memory studies and the significance of globalization for our conceptual toolkits. His long-standing engagement with memory studies dates back to the mid-90s. In 2001, he published The Holocaust and Memory in the Global Age together with Nathan Schneider at Zurkamp, and then after that, in 2006, it was revised in English. This is a very important book for Holocaust researcher. Thank you very much, Professor Levy. In 2010, he published Memory and Human Rights, co-authored once again with Nathan Schneider at Penn State University Press. He is co-editor of the Collective Memory Reader, together with Jeffrey Olick, and many greetings to Jeffrey Olick, because he is also very close to European Network of Remember Solidarity, and Vered Vinicki-Zeriosi. And the book was published by Oxford University Press in 2011. And right now, currently, Professor Daniel Levy is working on a monograph about such an important subject for 21st century, about the solidarity in the global age. The title of Professor Levy keynote is Mnemonic and its Discontents Between Integration and Contestation. Professor Levy, thank you very much that you accepted our invitation to the conference, and you accepted also invitation for tomorrow roundtable discussion. I am very, very happy that we can be together here. It's an honor for us, and it's a really great pleasure to have you here. And it's my pleasure to welcome you for our conference. The floor is yours, and we can wait for your keynote speech.
Thank you very much for these kind words, and also thank you for the kind invitation. I have to say I'm really impressed by the scope of your conference, and I'm particularly intrigued by the fact that you put the crucial relationship between the global and the local front and center, especially since this is mapped onto all kinds of other binary isms, such as universalism and particularism, and also nationalism and cosmopolitanism. Now, after having been reduced to be a Zoom remote teacher, I realized that anything longer than 30 minutes on that medium borders on torture. Zoom is what we use in the United States, is the equivalent of what we're using here for the conference. So let me also apologize in advance for my constant back and forth moving. It seems to be the only way I can get through a lecture while sitting. So let me tell you briefly what I will do today. I would like to make two central points. One is to capture the transformations of Holocaust memories and the way in which the global and local interact. And here I would like to direct your attention to an epistemological shift, namely the cosmopolitan turn, moving away from a pernicious methodological nationalism. I will focus my remarks on the conceptual surplus that a cosmopolitan approach can generate. Two, and related, we need to historicize our concepts and the mnemonic trajectories we study, especially since the global-local axis is frequently discussed and diffused in the form of global dominant tropes that have little bearing on local constellations. So I'd like to preface my comments by saying that I belong to the maximalist fashion in the field of memory studies. That is, I don't just think of memory as something that we study or something epiphenomenal. I also think of memory studies as something that we use to interrogate many other political and cultural phenomena. So in that sense, I'm very sympathetic to Jan Assmann's notion of memohistory. That is, a historical focus not only on factuality, but on the actuality of memories. Now, let me take you very briefly through the origins of methodological nationalism in the nation state. The invention of nationhood, famous phrase, essentially ushered in the permanent presence of memory politics. The nascent nation state of the late 19th century invented its past, and these pasts became part of a long chain of intergenerational transmissions. They helped establish national culture, which was an ideological prerequisite for the modern nation state. Memory was thus a key factor in creating, forming, and unifying the nation. Fast forward 2 world wars later, with the end of the Cold War and with the continuing strengthening of global interconnectedness, memory has once again become a significant factor in structuring contested debates about national culture. And many of these conflicts are now circumscribed by both endogenous and exogenous factors. All the while, global mnemonic tropes are providing a normative and discursive metrics. In a seminal article from 2011, Astrid Earle described 3 waves of memory studies. I'm not going to go into the first 2 waves. Excuse me. What I can say is we entered the 3rd wave around the time of the new millennium. The 3rd wave is focused on the impact of globalization. It explores both how we work with memory and how memory works. The 3rd wave seeks to break out from the national as the exclusive container of mnemonic processes. Our work, and I'm referring here primarily to my collaboration with Nathan Schneider, is part of this 3rd wave. Incidentally, and with all the requisite immodesty, I have suggested elsewhere that we were among the first in the late 1990s who attempted to liberate the study of collective memory from its national container. Our thesis about the cosmopolitanization of Holocaust memories is well suited for our purposes because it incorporates the various dynamics between the global and the local as a central component of democratic polities, rather than an aberration. First of all, cosmopolitan memory is part of a larger heuristic project. The focus here is on cosmopolitization as a process that can be studied, rather than just cosmopolitanism as a horizon of expectation or an aspirational language. Now, the main reason I think that the cosmopolitan approach yields an important conceptual and empirical surplus is the fact that it problematizes the nation state, gradually denaturalizing it, so to speak. The cosmopolitan turn suggests that particular orientations toward the past need to be reevaluated against the background of global memoryscapes. This is not to say that memory is no longer articulated within the nation state, but that we witness a pluralization of memories in empirical terms and also considering its normative validation. That is to say, these days we cherish the plurality of memories, at least we give lip service to it. This has given way to a fragmentation of memory, no longer beholding exclusively to the idea of the nation state. If I wanted to provoke you a little bit, I would say that this conference, the entire conference and the panels and the topic are testimony to that. But that's another issue that we can talk about, namely what is our role, if at all, in these processes. Now, to be very clear, our approach should not be mistaken with the denial of national realities. On the contrary, our argument is that in order to capture neo-nationalist phenomenon, we need to take a closer look at the cosmopolitanization of life worlds. So here we are playing on Michael Billig's notion of banal nationalism. So I would like to direct your attention to the banal cosmopolitanization a growing majority of people are exposed to. Granted, there are differences, actually, and these differences map a little bit onto the national cosmopolitan tension between, say, urban dwellers who are much more exposed to this kind of banal cosmopolitanism in the supermarket, in the environment, in the university, versus the rural population who has much less exposure to it, which is not to say that they are oblivious of it. Now, this is important because it reconfigures the main binary of the social sciences and the humanities, namely recombining and repurposing claims of universalism and particularism. A short history of the study of Holocaust memories is instructive. I present it schematically since you're the audience who knows this probably much better than I do. In our comparative study from the late 90s, we studied how the Holocaust has been commemorated in Germany, Israel, and the US from the end of World War II to the late 90s. We noticed that the apparent differences, perpetrators, victims, bystanders, to name but the most obvious ones, give way to a mnemonic patterning, so to speak, that is marked by references to a global language about the Holocaust. Being Europeanists, and given that it is where the Holocaust took place, we saw how the commemoration of the Holocaust was perceived, mostly by the political class, as a means to unite Europe around this violation of human rights. Now, the book was originally published in German in the fall of 2001 and coincided with 9/11. Talk about bad timing for the publication of a book. In many ways, 9/11 also marked the beginning of the end of the human rights regime, insofar as it was the start of a creeping securitization of human rights. So by the time the book was published with a new preface in English in 2006, we were already in a different period. We addressed the fate and manifestations of cosmopolitan memories in a second monograph, published in 2010, entitled Human Rights in Memory, which, by the way, got far less traction than the first book. I'm mentioning this because the reception of our main historical thesis was subsequently dehistoricized and frequently misinterpreted. The much beloved Strothman function in the game of product differentiation, otherwise known as academia. I'd like to briefly talk about the tropes that characterize these misinterpretations. And believe me, this is not so much a case of the usual academic narcissism, but rather illustrative of and suggestive for many of the conversations we continue having 20 years later. So here are some of the more prominent misreadings and misinterpretations. One, that we are too or were too optimistic, i.e. normative. Did we describe some of the better moments in that human rights regime with some enthusiasm? You bet. Did we mistake this snapshot of a decade for the final word? Certainly not. We actually showed how the Holocaust, far from being a unifying European symbol, became the primary mnemonic dividing line between Western, East, and Central Europe, with the comparison juxtaposition of Nazism and Stalinism. Already during the mid-2000s, there were rumblings, with the occasional scandal about establishing equivalences of the Holocaust and the Gulag, all related tropes of victimhood competition. Let me briefly mention the two declarations that capture and circumscribe the trajectory of Holocaust memory. One is the Stockholm International Forum on the Holocaust and its 2000 declaration that the Holocaust, the Shoah, fundamentally challenged the foundations of civilization. You can imagine how significant that was for our first book and how much that contributed to our kind of stipulating a certain unifying function. The other is the European Day of Remembrance for victims of Stalinism and Nazism, and subsequent EU declarations from 2008 and onward. They are a reflection of the growing resistance of former communist countries and the demand to address these issues as a function of totalitarianism. They don't necessarily use that word, but that's essentially the intention. I'm not going to go into detail here, but as someone who has looked into the parliamentary debates around these declarations, I can tell you they are a rich source to see the basic positions of different memory entrepreneurs. Nothing to say about how it reveals the latent competition of victimhood, which seems to be one steady characteristic of memory politics. A second misreading of our cosmopolitan approach was the charge that our thesis was relegating the nation state to the dustbin of history. As I pointed out before, nothing could be further from our intentions. Incidentally, one of our arguments is that part of the reason for hyper-nationalist rhetoric is a compensatory logic for the loss of some of its political and cultural sovereignty. So you have lots of cases studies that begin with Levy and Snyder claim, but the Estonian case shows that nationalism is well and alive. Yes, our argument is to reiterate not that cosmopolitanization puts an end to nationalism, let alone the nation state, but that we need to understand neo-nationalism, reactionary manifestations, so to speak, as a reaction to the perceived dangers of cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism here being a cipher for the other, migration, you name it. Thirdly, our thesis was conveniently mislabeled as universalistic. So that, for instance, the difference between Jeffrey Alexander's claim about the Holocaust as a universal symbol and our claim that appropriation of memories of the Holocaust are a more complex and past-dependent process was basically obfuscated. Just to be clear, and as is abundantly evident for many of the projects at this conference, we cannot take declared universalism by memory entrepreneurs at face value. Oftentimes, universalism serves as a screen memory. That is, it masks particular responsibility by relativizing it. I don't have to tell this to an audience attending a conference in Warsaw. You might remember the level of, how shall I refer it, absurdities during a recent spat between Germany, Israel, and Poland about who is responsible for the Holocaust, culminating in an official statement from the German government that the Holocaust was the sole responsibility of Germany. Let me take you to a brief, compressed historical trajectory of how the content and the significance of debates about Holocaust memories in the European context have changed. So memories of the Holocaust shaped the articulation of a new rights culture during the late 1990s. Once this new rights culture is in place, it no longer needs to rely on its original articulation, in this case the memory of the Holocaust, but it assumes strong normative powers. The Holocaust is now a concept that has been dislocated from space and time precisely because it can be used to dramatize any act of injustice, racism, or crime perpetrated anywhere on the planet. Incidentally, it is this decontextualized dimension, which frequently distorts or ignores actual historical facts, that has called some historians to the barricades against memory. The historians, or protagonists with autobiographical memories, might be upset with this dynamic of de and recontextualization. But it is precisely the vagueness that permits the kind of broad identification and mobilization we're witnessing around the human rights discourse. It is largely based on the process of decontextualization, which in turn requires a shift from concrete memories to abstract remembrance. Most opposition to injustice in general is now articulated through the categorical denial and remedial efforts of rights violation. Nation-states engage, or are expected to, with their own history in a cosmopolitan fashion, which entails the recognition of the other in forms of acknowledging past injustices. This dynamic explains both the importance of human rights norms as a globally available repertoire of legitimate claim-making and the particular appropriation of this universal script. Starting during the 1990s, compliance with a set of human rights norms such as dignity and rights for all has been circumscribing the legitimacy of unacceptable state actions. Adherence to a minimal set of human rights ideals had become a significant, albeit uneven factor in global politics and a prerequisite to preserving legitimate sovereignty. Almost 10 years later, in our Human Rights in Memory book, we identified a gradual shift showing that the human rights regime no longer commanded the same attention. Fast forward another 10 years to today, it would be easy to say that the human rights regime is more or less dead. I think it's no longer a regime in the sense that it commands binding norms and rules to which everybody subscribes. There's simply too many violations for this to remain a credible statement, let alone policy. So if the human rights regime expressed a brief moment of, let's call them rights politics that exercised the global pull, I would suggest that human rights are now the source of geopolitical divisions, in some cases mirroring the cosmopolitan nationalism binary, at least rhetorically, between liberal democracies and those increasingly illiberal movements and non-democratic states. You notice I don't use the term illiberal democracy. I think it's an oxymoron. I don't think there is such a thing. It's a little like during the Cold War, where both sides were blaming the other for neglecting half of the Human Rights Convention, right? So the Soviet Union would blame the United States for not abiding for the social and civic, for the social and economic parts of the Human Rights Convention, and the free world would blame the Soviet Union for not abiding by the other part of the equation, namely political and civic rights. Now, as for the Holocaust, or rather modalities of Holocaust remembrance, I think it is not an exaggeration to reiterate that if Holocaust memory was initially intended to provide a unifying trope for nascent Europe or European Union, it has now become one of several divisive vectors in an expanded Europe. And there's nothing wrong about that as long as we recognize that debates about memory politics and debates about who owns which narratives of the Holocaust are frequently proxies for other national debates. And few people know that as well as the organizers of this conference. So where do we go from here? There are three overlapping circles, and I'm sorry, I'm a sociologist, so I have to divide everything into three. The national, which is continuously contending with the aforementioned de facto cosmopolitanization, because that continues, social media, global mediascapes, academic interconnections, you name it, regional organizations, much of this is driven by technology, but obviously makes a huge difference. The second circle is the cosmopolitan, which is penetrating national spaces, but has to simultaneously contend with the embrace and the rejection of its very principles. And then there's the global, which has economic, cultural, and political dimensions. In economic terms, it exists in the world of finance, but I think in other realms of the economy, we're actually seeing the resurgence of economic nationalism supplanted by global agreements. In cultural terms, it is thriving through such initiatives in the form of One World Together at Home. Here we're being asked to celebrate our common humanity, which is a nice thing, but hardly a political concept, as we know from Hannah Arendt. Conversely, and I think the corona pandemic is making it clear, not even in times of a shared global crisis do we embrace the global. In political terms, it is reflected in such organizations as the UN and the WHO, in short, global organizations who have failed to act globally. And of course, as we know, there's no global government, there's no global democracy, there's no global culture. I'm even not sure if there's a global economy, given that it is the way it is balkanized in regional trade agreements. But, and I insist on this, and we can discuss it in our Q&A session, there are cosmopolitan vectors that impact all of these arenas. Cosmopolitanism captures and engages the continuously contested tensions between particularism and universalism. And cosmopolitanization is the process through which they are negotiated. Cosmopolitanization is transforming the nation state both from within and from outside. In other words, if we want to understand, say, the popular resurgence of authoritarian nationalism, we can't just compare it to 1917 or 1933. Are there similarities? Of course. Do we need historical comparisons? Absolutely. However, there are limits to these comparisons. The phenomenological horizons in 2020 are simply different. Take, for example, the corona pandemic and the proliferation of comparisons with earlier pandemics, from the Middle Ages to the Spanish flu. Earlier plagues in Europe, say, were certainly no picnic, but they took shape in a universe that provided meaningful relief. They could be absorbed in a kind of visitation theology, which stipulated that natural catastrophes were understood as a mode of communication between God and man, primarily experienced as a theological economy of sin and punishment. Most of us no longer have access to such a palliative narrative. All of this just to say that we need a mnemonic toolkit that corresponds to the dominant ideas and institutions of our time. And our mnemonics in form, technique, and content have been changing in the course of history. Let me conclude with a brief outlook and some provocations to make our discussion more challenging. One of our main conclusions is that we are living in a mnemonic age. Earlier formations of memory imperatives were driven by statist, top-down efforts. Recently, they have been joined by bottom-up efforts driven by all sorts of identity politics. Both operate with an implicit model of memory is or memory as justice. So one key interpretive issue regarding the cosmopolitanized memory imperative is the transition from heroic nation states to a form of statehood that establishes internal and external legitimacy through its support for skeptical narratives, thus challenging the kind of foundational quasi-mythical paths which previously served as generation-transcending fixed points. These post-heroic symptoms of statehood are based on a critical engagement with past injustices and the incorporation of human rights rhetoric and practices, which, by the way, is why the reactionary right is so adamant and cultivate their own national identitarianism by way of denying the other a politics of identity. Although there are more sophisticated versions of this in Western Europe, where they use a rhetorical twist to suggest that we are all entitled to our identity. Now, the cosmopolitan memory imperative and its neo-nationalist correlate are well and alive. See the continuous proliferation of historical revisionism undermining national myth. It is surely no coincidence that authoritarian leaders in the world are busy with their own historical revisionism, trying to resurrect whatever myth of a golden national age there might have been. The problem is just, I don't have to tell this to the organizers again, you're living it as we speak. The problem is that the resistance to it, the taking for granted of the national, is no longer given. We see the political cultural debates in rather contestations over representations of the past. In the US, there's a monumental debate about Confederate monuments and related issues of past representations. Also, debates about the Holocaust are increasingly linked to a reassessment and reckoning about colonialism. That is the colonial past of many developed and developing countries. See, for instance, the numerous commissions tasked to figure out the repatriation of cultural goods. These trends are also associated with the growing attention to transitional justice studies. The precarious balance between truth and justice is linked with traumatic memories commanding societies to remember their wrongs and pursue different forms of reconciliation through a host of mechanisms. Symbolic acknowledgement of past injustices through rituals of forgiveness, that is, apologies, related commemorative activities, post-heroic memorials, and the re-heroization of their counterparts, the recognition of victims and the responsibility of perpetrators, truth commissions, material compensation through a variety of restitutive measures, legal procedures, war crime trials, and more recently, as we will shortly hear from Danielle Luckstedt, even the codification of memory into laws, so-called memory laws. Transitology is by now a vast field and its details are beyond the scope of my comments. What matters for our theoretical purposes is that the prominence of memories of past injustices are reflective of and contribute to emerging forms of cultural identifications, collective self-understandings, and political legitimacy. To be sure, political legitimation has always depended on collective memory. In the past, I guess anthropologists referred to some of these things as myths and related issues. What distinguishes today's version is that it is driven by a critical introspection of one's negative pasts, what Jeffrey Ollick has termed the politics of regret. According to Ollick, the central question, and I quote, for a socio-historical theory of regret concern the ways regret is modern and the way modernity is regretful. So instead of getting stuck in the binary of national and cosmopolitan memory and the sometimes tedious discussion and implied normative need to castigate one is bad and the other is good, I would like to suggest, at least from a scholarly perspective, that it is precisely the friction between the two that provides a productive prism to get a sense of a particular society and its relationship to itself. If the foundational dynamic of nation-state formation was the invention of tradition, to quote Hobsbawm, the existential dynamic of post-national societies is the very contentions of these traditions. Let me end here so that we have enough time for questions and discussion. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, dear Daniel, for your very much inspiring, thought-provoking, and difficult lectures. Difficult in the sense that you gave us structuralized, fast road towards the changes of memory studies, waves, and the changes of Holocaust memory studies, and opening very provocative questions about the fourth way, as I understand, of the situation we are right now with the memory studies and the studies which are happening in 21st century, which is quite difficult and in which we have to reconsider what human right means, and we have to take under consideration that the human rights regime is over. And in the same moment, what was really striking for me in your speech, that maybe the concept that Holocaust was something what linked European countries and European Union, or supposed to linked as a common experience, as a fundamental experience, right now is something which divided, as I understand, right, or it could be a situation, a phenomenon which pushing us into completely different direction. It's not linking us, but push us to separate each other. And it's very sad, I would say. And as I'm talking from the anthropological point of view, as an European, as a member of European country, but also as a Jewish person, I mean, I would never suspect that such a vulnerable, sensitive, important topic, which of course was, I mean, fundamental from UN law in 1948, yes, against the genocide, and in 21st century became a topic which, as you asked, as you mentioned, by which we are asking the question, who is responsible for the Holocaust in 21st century, and who is also the owner of the memory of the Holocaust. So, I mean, it was, thank you very much for this lecture, because it's really stressing one of the most important and fragile and vulnerable questions for 21st century. I mean, what Holocaust, in which frame we should reach today the Holocaust studies and Holocaust memory. And of course, I am asking a question to myself if we choose the right word, because we choose the word between a local and global perspective. And of course, after your lecture, I would say maybe we should really use the word cosmopolitan, if I did understand right. So. Do you think that it's a time to change the tension between a global and local from the Holocaust studies into the global and cosmopolitan? Maybe that would be my first question. And the second question, the very first question would be, do you think that there is a way out from of what should we do on educational level, on academic level, or maybe on the grassroots level, when I'm thinking about NGOs who are working with the Holocaust remembrances and commemoration, if we would like to avoid these divisions which are happening right now on the, I would like to say on the state level, but probably it's more than state level. Probably it's a level of national identities in Europe. If there is any way out, if you see what we can do, like maybe the potential historia like Ariela Azoulay, to maybe focus on something which is not traumatic, but go forward into hope and solidarity more than this, as you call it, as Oli could rather call it, the politics of regret, of constant regretting. So maybe this is my second question, if there is a way out of this very vulnerable fundament, which are now a weapon of, is a weapon of division.
Okay, well, yeah, there are a lot of questions in your thing. Let me start by using your last point and then go backwards. I don't think we should be doing anything. Meaning, I don't know if it has any use to do anything in terms of what we do. We are just looking at what people are doing with these tropes. I'm not trying to remove the significance of non-governmental organizations and activists. They should teach history and show people what happened, although there's no way of doing that, because whatever way you choose, you will alienate the others. So I'm among those people who think that the very conflict and tension and the way people organize these contestations is what matters. I think Holocaust memory today is in many ways emblematic and symptomatic for the crisis of the nation. Okay, that is to say, we are living in an age where everybody or many places are lamenting that we are now living in divided societies. Rural, urban, young, old, it doesn't matter. The divisions may differ from place to place, and that is the normal state. There's this kind of desire for a harmonious, peace-loving societies, and so on and so forth. I would like that too, but I don't think that's the reality of societies in the 21st century. So the very divisions inside, I think, are given. So I don't know. Is there room for educational work? Of course. But you see, you also have a lot of, you would say, Holocaust, educational Holocaust sites, which themselves are contested. I don't have to tell you that. You are in the midst of one of them, and the same is true for Germany. What is the role of the Jewish museum, which is not even a Holocaust museum, and so I mean, you have these controversies everywhere, and the controversies always, if you look at it, are underlying a claim between a kind of cosmopolitan sensibility and a more particular sensibility. So the cosmopolitan sensibility is brought in some societies because the other is already present, and in other societies because all kinds of young academics and others are bringing these things back and introducing them into a conversation. So this is about reactionary, authoritarian nationalist regimes trying to contend with what is left of their civic societies. In the case of Poland, I'm not an expert in Hungary. It seems to me in Hungary the civic societies already eliminated. I'm using a stark term. So that's why I don't think that conflict is part of a problem. I mean, it is a problem. It is not nice, but it is. I'm sorry to say that it is what it is, and that's what we are trying to look at. As for the imperialist claim, my imperialist claim that a cosmopolitan approach is the right approach. I say that because it is the approach in the third wave, or if you want, the potential fourth wave, that problematizes the local and the global, not as just an issue, but as the central issue. It speaks about how people embrace and how people reject these outside or contested or detraditionalizing or retraditionalizing, whatever is the case. And as such, it is, I think, it subsumes, for instance, transnational memory under it, which is a very helpful term, which has been propagated by many people, which is practiced by quite a few. And just to be clear, I don't have to tell this to the audience, to this audience, but we are talking about memory studies by now is a huge field with thousands and thousands and thousands of articles, mostly case studies. So people are using these concepts quite a bit. I'm suggesting that we need to focus on the very kind of tension that you around which you organize the conference, because that's what it's going to be for a long time. There is no there might be exceptions in authoritarian countries, but I don't see. I don't even see that. There are some exceptions, for instance, in the Soviet Union or in Russia now. I'm thinking about the work of Daria Klevniuk, for instance.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your answer. I mean, I have already questions from our audience, but there is one question I would like to ask, once more question I would like to ask from myself. You are talking about the political legitimization that the Holocaust in terms of his universalization, universal uniqueness of a Holocaust, super universal Holocaust could bring the perspective in which the political legitimization is easier. I would call it a kind of umbrella, that this universal Holocaust creating a kind of umbrella. So we were speaking before about how it could divide, but sometimes it could also integrate it. But it's a kind of fake integration. It's an umbrella integration. And under this umbrella, there are different things happen. Black matter, dark matters, really. Sometimes secrets which could hide under Holocaust umbrella. What I'm speaking about, because maybe you will give me another example. I am very curious about your opinion. When I first recognized this protest, I was working in Rwanda. And of course, the Holocaust history, the Holocaust representation is super active there. And it brings the political legitimization to current state, of course, to the President Kagame, and somehow creating a safe zone and establishing the Hilberg Striada in this Rwandan context for Tutsi, Hutu, etc. But also bringing this Holocaust story in Rwanda create a kind of safe box, a historical box, while, you know, a few kilometers later in Democratic Republic of Congo, we have a huge war. But we are thinking about this region from the perspective of justice, transitional justice, reparation, and never again, and like a Holocaust story, which all these multiple representation, post-Holocaust almost representations, not even post-Rwandan or post-genocide in Rwanda, but post-Holocaust representation, visual representation, which are creating a kind of scene, a theatrical scene, in which we do believe that everything is fine. Because we already know the story, and the end of the story is never again. But the conflict is around, and the conflict is very active. But via this paradoxical integration of this Holocaust cosmopolitan, or rather universal symbol or representations, we are completely misleading the point which is violence. And I'm wondering if you do recognize also this kind of cosmopolitan, universal overuse of the Holocaust memory as an umbrella, which could be extremely dangerous, maybe
Yes.
in the United States or in Europe.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I was trying to get at that a little bit many years ago, and I'm talking about work that I did many years ago with Nathan Schneider. We talked about this, the notion of the universal as a screen to hide particular responsibility, which I think is what you are in part referring to, which reminds me some 10 years ago, I run a seminar at Columbia University called Redress and Reconciliation with Elazar Balkan, and we invited Philip Gurevich, who, as you know, is the author of I forgot the title of his book, but about Rwanda. It's a very provocative book, something like "Welcome, we're coming to kill you tomorrow," or something like this. And we asked him in, and he said, "I don't think you invited the right person." And we said, "What do you mean? We want to talk about reconciliation after this kind of genocide." And he said, "Well, there is none." And we said, "What do you mean?" "Well, people live in their house next door. Their uncle lives, and their uncle might have killed their family." Meaning, under those circumstances, there's just no reconciliation, which means that. And what did the Rwandan government do about that? They essentially, not unlike the Spaniards, who came up with a law of mandating forgetting. The Rwandans essentially made it illegal to talk about ethnicity.
Yes.
Right.
Of course.
Yes. So the point here is, I'm mentioning this in the context of official and private memory. With all the Holocaust education going on in Germany, for instance, which is really outstanding. This is not a whitewashing education. It's very kind of to the point. The lack of knowledge that German students have about the Holocaust is staggering. In the United States, they recently found that 1/3 of American youth don't know what Auschwitz is. That's in a country where, there's a Holocaust museum and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to get at here, the different dimensions, the official memory, the public memory and private memory, we know this from other works. So there are different levels of memory, and they all, are, let's say, and then there are the Zeitzeugen who have their own memory. So in other words, I think it's a very complex picture, and I'm not using complexity here as a way of not saying anything. I'm saying complexity that we need to also address when we make these statements.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you. The title was, if I remember correctly, "We wish to inform you that tomorrow we are going to kill you and all your family." Thank you very much.
Yes,
Daniel, about this, I could really speak hours. So thank you very much that we could also broad this non-European and non-American, but an Pan-African perspective. And now I, of course, have to ask. I'm super happy to ask you a question from our audience. So the first question we received. Dear Professor Daniel, do you think that the contextualization of Holocaust caused also changes in the cosmopolitan language? Word Holocaust is now more often used as a synonymous to the genocide, completely without the connection to the actual event. Do you think it is a chance to raise awareness, or rather it is a threat to lose the primary meaning?
I don't know. It's a very good question, and I think it is part of what I've tried to describe, or what we have tried to describe in this dynamic between decontextualization and recontextualization. Look, I don't know what to say if somebody talks about an ecological Holocaust. The word ecology here is a stand-in for catastrophe, disaster, human rights. It stands as a cipher for everything. If you want to, and then of course any Holocaust scholar will be offended by it. Nothing to say about people who suffered from the Holocaust. But I think it is language. We cannot protect language. Obviously, what people want to signal, they want to dramatize this, and I think. Yes, I may have a personal opinion on it, but it really doesn't matter. People will do that, and it just undermines, it underlines what we've tried to say before, that it has become a cipher for mass violence and other related issues.
Thank you very much. Just from my notes, I don't know if I understood you correctly, but when you are talking about the process of decontextualization, you also mentioned later that there's a kind of phenomenon which is happening after or around this process of decontextualization. So the concrete memory becomes an abstractive one. And in the process of decontextualization, we have to take under the consideration this kind of link that, I mean, because of the universalization, because of the cosmopolitization, because of geopolitical interest, something what was concrete, I would say even embodied physical evidence, authentic, I don't know, but memory, especially in the museum studies, they like this word, authenticity, became abstractive. And talking about language, I have a feeling that maybe there is something that the word genocide became abstractive somehow, somewhere. Because of this crisis of the human rights, but we are not sure what the genocide is, because before we give a label that something is a genocide, I mean, there are, mass crimes and mass atrocities, and then there is an international tribunal, and then we need an investigation, and then an investigation takes 10 years, and then we are waiting so many years to use the word. So somehow this abstraction maybe is also in the word genocide. I don't know if I understand this process of the contextualization right, but I think it's the contextualization means really to a huge auto-reflective and auto-critical process to not maybe change a name, but to redefine what is behind the word Holocaust and what is behind the word genocide as well. I think like that, because it's very easy to be from concrete to abstractive in this geopolitical stand right now, and this is quite sad.
But that move is also inherent in any form of commemoration, if you think about it. I mean, it's not just it's not an accident. It's a built-in part
of course,
rendering, freezing a picture of history into whatever the representation is. Preferably we want it to be an accurate one, but and then even if it's an accurate one, we don't know what the reader, how the reader decodes it. So there are a lot of problems. Yeah.
Dear Daniel, now I have a question from Zofia Wójcicka from German Historical Institute, Dr. Zofia Wójcicka. As she is writing, dear Professor Levy, thank you for the interesting lecture. You argued that your thesis on emergence of a cosmopolitan Holocaust memory did not contradict the emergence of neo-nationalism. In contrary, neo-nationalism could be understood as a reaction to the cosmopolitanization. Looking at the recent developments, couldn't one rather say that this cosmopolitanization process was just very superficial? Then, in fact, common terms, symbols, motifs were just misused by different national and other memory agents in very different, sometimes subversive ways?
Yes, absolutely. I don't think they are mutually exclusive. I think that lots of leaders, I think it's a very thin veneer. I agree with that. And I use the human rights regime and its fate as an example for, how shall I say, this is why I'm treating our work or the notion of Holocaust memory as a time diagnostic incident and not as some kind of holistic, universally true, eternally true thing. This is why I'm personally trying to say that for us as scholars, we cannot use an essential categorical understanding of Holocaust because this is not how it's being deployed. So, yes, Sophia, absolutely a symphony of cosmopolitanism. However, I will say this, if in the 90s and early 2000s, everybody was jumping on it and using cosmopolitan light to get more money and to get more legitimacy and so on and so forth, now we have a new phenomenon, and that is the outward rejection of cosmopolitanism. Okay, Orban does not claim to be anything but the same is for Poland, Slovakia, Turkey, Russia, and so on and so forth. Here and there, there was a little bit. Putin was interesting, with the issue of gays and LGBT because of the Olympics, but that was nobody took that serious. So I agree with you. At the same time, it's also interesting. We have moved from the kind of instrumental strategic use of cosmopolitanism to its outright rejection. The rejection comes in the form of, in the United States, for instance, the cipher for that is globalists, which is also, of course, an anti-Semitic trope, but use globalists as in order to distinguish them from what must be called white supremacists. There's no other word for these people. So I agree, but I think the term is still useful because I would say, for instance, that that your group who wants to reclaim national society, I'm meaning you, not you, but who wants to reclaim a Poland that has a different vision, a democratic Poland, or whatever, or whatnot, is effectively threading on and using and attempting to use this cosmopolitan terminology, even if for strategic reasons sometimes you have to say no, or it depends. There are countries where you can only reclaim any kind of meaningful position in the field of national discourse by saying that we are the real nationals. But that's not even, so in other words, we reclaim the flag, but that's not even what you are doing in a sense. So I think cosmopolitanism remains part of the equation for NGOs, for social movements, for some political parties, and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel. I think that we have time for maybe one more question, and I'm still waiting for a question from audience. I know the boys are printing it, but I have one more question from my side about the museums, about the exhibition, about the current exhibitions around the Holocaust memory topic in the age of. I want to say globalization, but of course I'm thinking about the cosmopolitization. Cosmopolitization is difficult for me to give a proper name.
I have to.
Cosmopolitanization. Yes. If you maybe met some or discovered some exhibition which was somehow symbolic for this kind of processes you are mentioning about, I would say, the beginning of this fourth way of Holocaust memory studies. I know that you were doing some research in Sweden, as I remember, or you were taking under consideration the museum in Sweden? No, it wasn't in Sweden. Some kind of exhibition which was, I'm just thinking, I mean, maybe you discovered something else, what you found interesting or somehow difficult in terms of current exhibition on Holocaust studies. And of course, I'm talking in a critical perspective. In Europe or in United States, because we see the trends, many trends, that we see the ways also in museum studies. But I would say from this geopolitical situation and this nationalistic situation we are talking about, and this human rights situation and constant need of creating a new exhibition, what is really interesting, on Holocaust, from very different reasons. Very different reasons. It's also kind of playground, a geopolitical playground, a museological playground. Did you find something interesting or you would like to describe as a sign of the age?
I think, no, I have nothing original to add, especially in light of the many great case studies that this conference and other things that I've seen at the Memory Studies Association have produced. I think the main finding here is that museums have become the site for these controversies. And very political, but curators obviously are now involved in the memory field. There are many of them are they're reflexive. They know what they're doing or what they're not doing. So they're conversant in this language, and this is part of their conversations. And it depends on the country. It depends on the museum. It depends on who is sponsoring it and where's the money coming from, and so on and so forth. So I think museums right now are the hot topic. And it's interesting, actually, now that you mention it, if museums were the cultural, aside from education, the cultural and the draft, the cultural site where the nation was formed. And museums, as you know, are an invention of, if I'm not mistaken, the 19th century, and really proliferate at the end of the 19th century. All these big museums, Metropolitan and all of these places, they were there to provide the foundation for these respective nations. If you think about it, it's an irony, or maybe not, that now museums once again, 100 years or 125 years or 150 years, if you want, after the invention of the nation state, you have museums once again being the site of contestation for reimagining the polity. And I'm not, this is contested, but I think that's one should probably, maybe there's a student out there for dissertation from A to C, from A to B. I don't know which steps there would be, but I think that's part of it. Yes.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Levy. It was a great pleasure to have you here. It was really great lecture, really great keynote, and thank you very much for discussion. And I just want to say that it's a pity that we cannot see each other here, but I hope that this virtual situation also helps us to be together for a little while. And thank you very much, and intellectually as well. Thank you, our audience and technicians. And we are going to meet in 15 minutes time, and now we have a technical break. Professor Levy, of course, you're very welcome to join us in the second part of our conference. See you soon. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions.
good afternoon, according to Central Eastern Time. Here we are again. Welcome on the 7th session of John Lodis Conference, titled Holocaust Memory Diagnosing the Global Effect. After the keynote lecture of Professor Daniel Levy, thanks Daniel once more time, I just would like to remind you that the title was Mnemonic and its content between integration and contestation, and always you can find our videos at the website of European Network Remember Solidarity at the YouTube, so you're always welcome to listen it once again if you would have a chance and possibility and you would like to do that. You are very welcome. And now we are starting the second part of our meeting. Today we are continuing our session with 4 presenters, and we have a little technical problems with contact with Professor Yi-Hun Lim. So I would suggest that we first start with Josephine Onke presentation, if it would be possible, and then of course we will try to connect with Professor Yi-Hun Lim. So I would like to welcome Josephine and a little biographical statement. Josephine Honke is a doctoral researcher at the University of Constance, Germany, who was involved in the transfer project Memose, including an online portal for a local memory site as an academic staff member. In her dissertation project, this is a working title, Film Where You Stand, the German narratives of victimhood during and after the Second World War in contemporary German testimony videos with communal focus on YouTube. It's really great that this social media becoming an important academic source, so thank you very much because I think it's really necessary. Josephine analyzes YouTube videos as media of municipal memories while focusing on aesthetical as well as narratological construction of German witnesses therein. She previously studied in Weimar, Lyon, and Berkeley, combining cultural and media studies. The title of her presentation, The Ambivalence of Local Memories Online, Holocaust Survivors as Archetypes for the Depiction of German Victims, of course, yes, and YouTube videos, in a quotation mark. Thank you very much, Josephine, for this important presentation you are going to deliver right now. I mean, abstract sounds really interesting. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. The stills I'm showing you now are taken from YouTube videos, and an array of filmic and cultural markers allows us to immediately identify the persons as so-called talking heads, who are most likely sharing their experiences from the past. What are your first associations? Who are these people? What could they be talking about? Are they Holocaust survivors? No. None of them is a survivor of the Shoah. In these videos, the people on screen are talking about bombings of German cities during World War II. Further, we cannot make out that the videos were filmed by amateurs, who are neither professional filmmakers nor historians. Yet, the witnesses are automatically associated with trustworthiness, authenticity, and credibility. Why is that? Today, I will highlight a few reasons for these associations. And the first presentation, please. Media and educational sciences have highlighted the importance of video portals, such as YouTube, especially for younger generations. In Germany, YouTube is the most popular online service among teenagers, with over 90% of them stating to regularly use the platform. YouTube enables almost everyone with an internet connection to upload videos. These videos are instantly made visible globally. Among them is an ever-growing number of videos with historic content. Yet, while digital memory studies are still a growing field, there has been limited research on narratives about the past spread through online videos. Today, I would like to start highlighting the importance of such research, by showing that there are online videos of World War II portraying Germans as victims and victims only, by mobilizing a concept of universal victimhood, as was described by Professor Levy and Schneider, which is rooted in cosmopolitized memories that the great lecture we just heard by Professor Levy reminded us of. Ultimately, and possibly despite the filmmakers' and the witnesses' own intentions, these videos might face the danger of being used for right-wing propaganda. Therefore, acknowledging their existence and analyzing the narratives used in these videos has become a pressing need. To show the dangerous potential of local history videos portraying German bombing survivors on YouTube, I will start by, firstly, highlighting the local content on the global platform. Secondly, I'm going to summarize the development of Holocaust survivors becoming filmic symbols that are then applied to other witnesses telling their accounts. Thirdly, I will finish my presentation by giving an example of the perception of Germans as victims by showing you a recent YouTube video. I will start by showing how local history YouTube videos are uploaded onto a platform that makes them globally accessible, thus turning the portrayed historical narratives focusing on specific places into local memories. First part, local memories on YouTube. YouTube is the leading video portal and one of the most visited websites worldwide. It is almost globally accessible. YouTube has launched local versions in more than 100 countries and is available in a total of 80 different languages. In a more and more globalized world, a digital tool such as YouTube can have a great impact on network memories. Network memories are part of recent developments in cultural memory studies that have increasingly explored an approach of multifaceted, fluid memory networks constantly shifting in a multitude of media. Users upload videos in which their perspectives of the past is engraved. They are used as what Astrid Earle calls memory media, for they have an impact on these processes and especially allow a bottom-up influence on memory cultures. This means that not states and official institutions alone form the pictures of the past, but the people themselves shape the histories they wish to continue to tell. This is what Andrew Hoskins referred to as the memory of the multitude. Megan Sheehy describes one form of history videos on YouTube as videos with strong connection to place. Thereby, she highlights a phenomenon focusing on the local anchoring of the videos. The filmed people speak about a specific local history for which they act as experts, simply because they have lived through it at the exact place. This is far from being problematic. Yet, I do believe that the amateur YouTube videos that focus on local histories are indeed part of the people's history, rightfully also referred to as history from below or the history of mentalities. These micro-histories are part of a non-institutionalized form of sharing memories for the future and form a crucial part of the democratization of history. I argue what can be observed in such videos is what Malte Thiessen referred to as kommunales Gedächtnis, municipal memories. He coined the term to embody a layer situated between national memories and family memories. Therefore, the videos do foster cultural engagement with the history in their respective geographically defined areas. It is here, in what can be referred to as a filter bubble, that they can achieve significant and even manipulative impact. Due to their one-sided focus, the videos are highly ambivalent and can be especially dangerous when politically exploited. Yet, they do show an important part of the history as well as current memory cultures and give voice to Germans that were mainly children during World War II. I was able to detect two key elements in my analyses of amateur local history videos that highlight specific geographic localization. First, references to specific places that are directly named and oftentimes visually represented. These are presented in the form of present-day footage, close-ups of street names or landmarks, as well as inserted screenshots, for example, from Google Maps. This has a special effect of recognition on viewers who know these places and have been there before, just as it is exciting to see a place on TV you have already been to, or even more so if your hometown is shown. Secondly, the witnesses talking in these videos almost always speak in dialect that can easily be tied to a specific region. They are perceived as eyewitnesses, deeply rooted in the region, who are then authorized to be speaking about the local history. In the second part of my presentation, I will show how the survivors of the Shoah have become media figures and even universal symbols for the depiction of eyewitnesses. Second part, Holocaust survivors as archetypes. Due to the mobilization of what Ebrecht Hartmann referred to as medial memory, the witnesses in the YouTube videos are associated with survivors of the Shoah. This so-called mediales Gedächtnis by Ebrecht Hartmann signifies a memory network of images, visual icons, symbols, stereotypical figures, and conventionalized narratives. In YouTube videos, as in the documentaries they imitate, we find cinematic strategies of emotionalization and dramatization, because the videos on YouTube mirror compilation TV documentaries of the 2000s. The amateur videos are similarly narrated with the use of highly emotive pathetic formulas. As imitative amateurs, they also copy the format of witness accounts. Therefore, witnesses can be regarded as media figures with specific conventional standards in their filmic representation. As soon as they are seen on screen, viewers commence their documentary reading, a term coined by Roger Audin. This means that the media figure of the witness is recognizable at first glance and leads to the instant classification of the video to the documentary genre with an automatically associated claim of truthfulness. This credibility is further reinforced by the emotionalization and authentication functions of the witnesses. The historian Frank Bösch states, "Their subjective interpretations are spread with the authority of the one who had been present." End of quote. But where does this authenticity derive from? I argue that the authenticity derives from the Holocaust survivors and the emergence of the witnesses as media figures. Annette Wiwiorka calls the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961 the birth of the contemporary witnesses. It was here that the witnesses stood at the center of a juridical trial and were given the right to not speak on the matter. From the film material of the Eichmann trial, the scenes of the witnesses speaking became very demanded by TV stations all over the world. A new media figure was born. Since then, Holocaust survivors have been increasingly mediatized. The demand just highlighted in the aftermath of the Eichmann trial was similarly achieved by two media products that led to so-called memory booms. On the one hand, by the US-American television series Holocaust, broadcast in the US in 1978 and in Germany in 1979, and on the other hand, by Schindler's List by Steven Spielberg from 1993. One side effect of this increasing mediatization of Shoah survivors is that they now function as archetypes. An archetype, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is a typical example of something or the original model of something from which others are copied. This means Holocaust victims have been turned into universal symbols and blueprints to similarly construct witnesses of other historic events. These can be even diametrically opposed to the stories of the survivors of the Shoah, as is the case in the YouTube videos of Germans describing their experiences of bomb raids on German cities during World War II. They are portrayed as survivors and victims of these bombings, Aleida Assmann summarizes the development of Holocaust survivors serving as archetypes with the words, "The Holocaust is now established as the paradigm of testimony that other testimonies in other social, political, and cultural contexts can be based upon." Tobias Edbrecht-Hartmann is even more specific to whom this cinematic framing as a witness is being extended, and I quote, "The witnesses of the crimes and the spectators, followers, and perpetrators and their divergent point of view are formally made the same, and their different perspectives are harmonized in a concept of testimony that has been purged of its legal meaning." End of quote. So the dangerous effects this can have can be proven when we take a closer look at the construction of German victims of World War II, which will lead us to the third and final part of my presentation. Third part, German victims, end quote. I want to illustrate the theories and concepts that I presented so far by showing you an exemplary video excerpt of a YouTube video. The German title of this amateur documentary translates to Shadow of the Past. The video focuses on the account of the witness Rudi Schaaf, who shares his memories with the viewers. He talks about an air raid on his hometown of Bamberg in Bavaria in April 1945. I will provide a translation after the short clip from the YouTube video. And for those of you who do not understand German, it will nonetheless be interesting to focus on the cinematic means of presentation, such as music and sound and the use of footage and images. You may start the video, please.
Aufgewachsen ist er damals in bodenständigen Verhältnissen im beschaulichen Bamberg, wie diese Originalfilmaufnahmen aus den Jahren 1942 bis 1944 zeigen. Zusammen mit seinem kleineren Bruder Adolf und seiner noch jüngeren Schwester Isolde verbringt Rudi eigentlich eine unbeschwerte Kindheit. Noch sind die Schrecken des Krieges nicht angekommen. Erst als der Vater an die Front muss, beginnt die Leidenszeit für ihn und seine Familie.
The voiceover stated, "He grew up in down-to-earth circumstances in the tranquil Bamberg, as is shown in this original film footage from the years 1942 to 1944. Together with his younger brother Adolf and his even younger sister Isolde, Rudi essentially spends an untroubled childhood. The horrors of war have not yet arrived. Only when the father is sent to the front, the time of suffering for him and his family begins." To highlight only some of the problematic aspects from this short excerpt, I have taken 3 stills introduced as original film footage by the narrator. This short clip is part of the introduction of the witness and protagonist of the amateur documentary. As a well-known part of documentaries, the black and white sequences activate a documentary reading in the viewers. They symbolize the past and seem authentical. Therefore, they are registered as trustworthy and underline what is said by the narrator. Aspects such as the strongly ideologically influenced names of Schaaf's siblings turn into side notes and can easily be overlooked, even though they are indeed stated. The solemn phrases such as "the horrors of war," "the time of suffering," further form an easy-to-believe and therefore strong narrative. All aspects, even the sound design, verify and confirm each other, forming a single narrative that is emotionally appealing to viewers and focuses on the German witnesses as the victims of World War II. In the example, we even saw a portrait of Hitler that was part of the original footage that was introduced as showing the down-to-earth circumstances in the tranquil Bamberg. Yet, I argue that this is not meant to strike the viewer because the video makes use of such a strongly narrated voice of God documentarism throughout the whole video that it pre-formulates all opinions for the viewers so that they only have to consume and not question them. In the context and the aftermath of the Second World War, the coping strategy of focusing and regarding Germans as victims stands in stark contrast to the Germans as the perpetrators. Yet, not only the extremist right used and uses the simplified categorization as a strategy to be able to negate any wrongdoing, the perception of the Germans as victims of the Second World War has a long-standing tradition that is still continuing, as I hinted at in my analysis. You can end the presentation, please. The different victim narratives have been reinforced in intergenerational dialogue and the transgenerational transmission of memories. Harald Welzer and his team have spent years to research the traditionalization of family stories about World War II. They are best known for their study entitled Grandpa wasn't a Nazi. This title strikingly summarizes what remembrance in German families focuses on: the impossibility to perceive one's own family members as perpetrators. Welzer and his colleagues further categorized 5 different types of traditionalization of family memories and their respective coping mechanisms. These categories of transmission are victimhood, justification, distancing, fascination, and being overwhelmed. But what are the Germans victims of? There is a wide range of different narrations that are used to be able to turn Germans into victims, ranging from victimization of the war in general, with soldiers suffering and being prisoners of war in camps, to victimization of forced migration movements, the German ex-police, and finally, even the perception of the Germans as victims of an enticing demagogue. However, most strikingly, even in today's memory cultures, the Germans are most often focused on as victims of Allied bombings. What viewers make of these different counter-narratives focusing on Germans as victims rather than perpetrators remains out of control. To admit their existence is the first step towards being able to educate about their critical reception, especially a younger generation that obtains an important part of its historical imagination and knowledge about the Holocaust and National Socialism from popular online sources. The ability of future generations to gain an understanding of the gray zones, that there is a multitude of different overlapping roles people had in the past. These are ranging beyond a simplified distinction between perpetrators and victims. The acknowledgement that there are also different forms of being a victim urgently needs to become a goal of Holocaust education, especially when the same cinematic devices are used to portray them. Furthermore, concepts such that of Rothberg, of the implicated subjects, and other hybrid forms of involvement in history need to be transported into documentaries and representations of the past, so that questioning distinct black and white categories between victims and perpetrators of history becomes part of the historic narratives, as well as a contextualization, and to allude to Professor Levy's talk he just told, also the recontextualization of memories. Thank you very much for your attention, and thanks to the technicians and organizers of the conference before and during my presentation.
Thank you very much, Josephine. Thank you very much for your clear, well-structured presentation. In time, Daniel Levy, he was speaking about division in 3 parts. So you had 3 parts. It was perfect, and I
Even
think
though
I'm
I'm
going.
not a sociologist.
Me neither, but I'm going to borrow this method as well because it was really very well established. And you were speaking very interesting about how private memory via digital and social media became somehow global, cosmopolitan, and in the same moment needs this critical approach. So we can say that somehow, somewhere, digital social media became a kind of trigger for critical thoughts approach. So it was very interesting, and I hope that you will have many questions, and also the commentator also will be involved in your presentation. Thank you very much. Luckily, we managed to contact with Professor Lim. Just before I will introduce Professor Lim, I just would like to remind you very, very quickly that we can ask questions. And for those who follow the transmission on YouTube or Facebook, you are writing email address, dianologies@enrs.eu. And for those who are follow us on Zoom, of course, you are participants of the more active participant, and you can ask a question directly via Q&A panel. And we encourage you very much to do that because this is even we are in virtual situation, we have a chance to be in intellectual connection, and for us it's very, very, very important. And right now I would like to kindly welcome, we are very honored, Professor Rihun Lim. Hello, Professor. Good afternoon.
Hi.
Good afternoon.
Good night. It's
good
midnight
night
here.
A global word.
Yeah.
Good evening, Professor. First, a little biographical statement. Professor Rihun Lim is a professor of transnational history and director of the Critical Global Studies Institute at Sogang University in Seoul. You are very much in connection, in relation with European Network on Remembrance and Solidarity. So thank you very much that you are here once again. He is the principal. Our pleasure too. He is the principal investigator, you are a principal investigator of the international research project titled Mnemonic Solidarity, Colonialism, War and Genocide in the Global Memory Space. As I understand, the project started in 2017, and luckily it will be a long project because it will take till 2024. Professor Rihun Lim is an author of so many important books, and immediately I recommend you to visit European Network website with abstracts of our participants, because then you can find all the titles. And right now, we strongly recommend you. But right now, of course, I'm going to mention just a few. Co-editor of the Telegraph series of Entangled Memories in the Global South. His published work in memory studies include as well Memory War, How Could Perpetrators Become Victims? It was published in Korean in 2019. As well, Triple Victimhood on the Mnemonic Confluence of the Holocaust, Stalinist Crime and Colonial Genocide. In a very important journal for me, it was published in the Journal of Genocide Research in April 2020. And next one, the Mnemonic Solidarity in the Global Memory Space, as I understand, is connected with the project, and it was published in January 2019. And also we are waiting for new, forthcoming text books. One of the books titled Global East, Remembering, Imagining, Mobilizing. It will be published in Columbia University Press 2020. And also we are waiting for Mnemonic Solidarity Global Intervention, co-edited with F. Rosenhaft, and it will be published in Pelgraph in 2020. The title of a presentation of Professor Lim is Critical Relativization as a Mnemonic Nexus on the Global Confluence of the Holocaust and Post-Colonial Memories. Dear Professor, you are very welcome. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Today, this critical relativization as a mnemonic nexus is still, my idea is under development. So it's not the really well-established thesis, but just in a very vague terms, I want to share my problematics regarding this critical relativization with all of you. And even before the cosmopolitanization of Holocaust, we can see the Holocaust narratives and post-colonial narratives were closely bound up with each other in 1950s and early 1960s. Immediately after the Second World War, for example, W.E.B. Du Bois, a famous African American leftist sociologist, visited a ghetto in Warsaw. So in the ruins of Warsaw Ghetto, he was reminding himself of these slaveries and anxieties of the African American slaves and something like that. Also, Franz Fanon, Hannah Arendt, Alain René, Charlotte Delvaux, as Michael Rosberg very explicitly explained in his book of multidirectional memory, we can see certain combination of Holocaust narratives and post-colonial narratives in 1950s and 60s. Means that, if you have a look at United States in the mid 1960s, in the whole United States, there is just one course on Holocaust. Under those circumstances, so this sort of combination or combination or the bounding up of these Holocaust and post-colonial narratives are very impressive, and each is beyond our imagination. But from certain moment on, this post-colonial narrative and the Holocaust narrative just separated. I don't know exactly what year was this point of the separation, but certainly we can see that post-colonial narrative has sustained sort of criticism of Western societies and their liberal democracies for their ongoing structural involvement in the acts of domination, racism, extreme violence, and criminality, while the Holocaust has become a sort of reassuring narrative of Western society. I mean, if you have a look at the Tony Blair's multiculturalism in Great Britain can be your only guarantee to prevent never again, and something like that. So that was already pointed out very well by Zygmunt Bauman or Amos Goldberg in Israel. But this sort of, this dichotomy of the a post-colonial criticism of Western liberal democracy and the political use of Holocaust to give a legitimacy to the liberal democracy in the West is related with a sort of historical way of thinking. For example, John Dovek, the German John Dovek thesis, as actually Ralph Dahrendorf raised the question, why wasn't Germany England? What's the underlying implication under this sort of question raised by Ralph Dahrendorf means that the Holocaust was perpetrated in Germany because Germany was not like England, which has developed a liberal democracy in a proper terms. So-called these John Dovek German peculiarities, in a sense, was a way of historical thinking to explain why Holocaust was done in Germany. Then if you have a look at the 1950s People's Poll and Polska Ludowa, we can see a very, very, very well developed certain studies on the social post-colonialism. Adam Kola recently articulated how the socialist post-colonialism has developed in the People's Poll and in the 1950s. And I was really stunned by that the Amy Cezar's classical text of Discourse on Colonialism was published in Polish just a few months immediately after the original publication of Amy Cezar's book in French. Means that Polish intellectuals or Polish critical intellectuals was well aware of these post-colonial discourses already in 1950. And in a sense, this sort of post-colonial awareness was continued to the economic history by Maria Mauerwitz. He was a sort of precursor to the Immanuel Wallerstein's world system theory. World system means that Poles or Polish intellectual circle, in a sense, had developed relatively very good a perception of post-colonialism even in 1950s and 60s. But certainly after 1989, after the fall from Yalta to Malta, I mean, the Polish version of Eurocentrism appears on the scene, especially after the breakup of a communist system or Eastern Bloc. This is certainly a very um, surprising turning from the post-colonial perceptivity to the outdated Eurocentrism in Poland and also many of East European countries. So, I mean, when I had a look at history textbooks in the Lyceum, the high schools in Poland, that was published in this century, the first decade of 21st century. I was really surprised by that these authors, without any hesitance, talked of the importance of Eurocentric views of world history and global history because Europe has played the most important role in developing a modern world or a modernity and global modernity and something like that. So certainly, under the communist rule, contrary to our belief, there was a very well developed sense of post colonialism in People's Poland, while that sort of post colonial problematic suddenly has given in to the sort of Eurocentrism. I think this is related with the very late translation of Larry Wolf's book of Inventing Eastern Europe. If you have a look at the Russian translation was done in 2003, and even Ukrainian translation was done in 2009, but Polish translation was done only in this year. Why that late? In comparison to the Polish translation of Amy Cesar in 1950, this Polish translation of Larry Wolf was quite late, even compared to Russia and the Ukraine. Where is the reason for this delayed translation of Larry Wolf's book into Polish? I think it is related with a sort of retreat of the post-colonial perspectives or post-colonial problematics among the Polish intellectual circle. So perhaps the Larry's book carries a certain inconvenient or uncomfortable grains of historical interpretation about Poland or Eastern Europe in general, because Eastern Europe as the West first model of underdevelopment and also stereotyped Orientalist visions of Eastern Europe actually has been developed by Larry Wolf. So Larry Wolf used the term of demi-Orientalism by the Western European intellectuals towards Eastern Europe. It might be a very uncomfortable truth to pose, but if we have a look at the German Ostforschung, is Polish studies, it's actually Eastern studies, right? And together with Japan's Toyogaku, it's a Japan's Orientalism towards China and Korea. So we can see a very close parallel between German Orientalism of the Slavic East and Japanese Orientalism of its Asian East, such as China and Korea. But in the 1990s or from the late 1980s, we can see a trend of reuniting a Holocaust narrative and post-colonial narrative. And Zygmunt Bauman's Modernity and the Holocausts perhaps opened the gate to this. And also Leszek Kołakowski, he proposed a Polish society needs a historical strike po polsku, and means that the Polish preoccupation with the Polish victimhood of Stalinist crime, in a sense, needs to be relativized in the global context, especially with regard to the Holocaust. So this Leszek Kołakowski's suggestion for historical strike po polsku was made before the Jan Gross book of Neighbors. So in a sense, he foresaw certain a Polish debates which later developed in Polish society regarding a Jan Gross a neighbors. And also in Australia, Dr. Moses asserted and stressed the comparability between colonial genocide, slavery, apartheid, the KKK, and the Holocaust. And also, even before William Chimmerer's a landmark book of post-colonial perspectives of Holocaust, we have a long list of the studies based on the post-colonial perspectives on Holocaust and sees Nazism as a colonial project. Michael Burley, Mark Mazo, Ian Kershaw, Sven Lindqvist, William Chimmerer, Andrew Trevorrow, Benjamin Medley, Doc Moses, Dan Stone, Christine Kopp, Timo Schneider, and Carol Kackel. And nowadays, suddenly in the domain of transnational history in the United States, we can see the flourishing studies of the comparing American from the frontier in the American West in the 19th century and the inner colonialization of the West in the United States in 19th century and the German colonization or German aggression to Eastern Europe. Also, we can see the German colonial imagination, a certain discursive links between the Slavic Wild East and overseas colonialism. So just this year, Michael Rosberg talked of historical strike 2.0 version, a new version of historical strikes based on his analysis of recent German controversies over Mbembe affair. But also in 1960s, there was certain juxtaposition of the certain post-colonial or colonial experiences and Holocaust. This picture is a Japanese Buddhist monk who was a peace activist in Hiroshima. Actually, he paid a visit to Auschwitz in 1962. He took part in the anniversary of liberation of Auschwitz by the Red Army in January 27th of 1962. And there's a very long hidden stories behind this so-called Hiroshima Auschwitz Peace March. Actually, Polish Catholic, a pro-government Catholic organization, PAX, is involved in the arranging this peace march, but also is related with the a Japanese a certain sorry. Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah. This is in Japan. In the Japanese post-war memory, Auschwitz has been Auschwitz and Hiroshima has been combined as a symbol of the victims of white racism in general. Still, Japanese nationalists keep that parallelism in keeping Auschwitz and Hiroshima together as a sign of the white racist, a victimization of Jews and the Japanese. And then I will skip this and then I will go to a critical relativization directly. So after the historical strike in 1986 and 87 in West Germany, relativization has become a sort of taboo because Ernst Nolte's a concept of European civil war and later global civil war, and his way of interpreting Nazism as a response to Bolshevism, in a sense, gave certain justified an exoneration of Nazi crimes by projecting the responsibility for the Holocaust on the Soviet Union and relativizing the Holocaust through juxtaposition with the Stalinists. And also when I saw the certain video clips or newses in the unified Germany, very often neo-Nazis actually took the slogan while they were making demonstration, no hierarchy in victims. And they protested against the so-called prioritization of Holocaust victims compared to the Stalinist crimes victims. So this is really a politically misused and abused very often the relativization by German conservatives in 1980s and also neo-Nazis in the first decade of 21st century. On the other hand, there were certain a trends of this making a cosmopolitan memories or global memories in the this 21st century. Stockholm Declaration, as Daniel Levy talked, and also 2008 Prague Declaration is about the equal treatment and non-discrimination of victims between Holocaust victims and victims of Stalinist crimes. And also 70 years declaration in 2012, still some scholars who are arguing for the uniqueness of the Holocaust refuted Prague Declaration by using the concept of uniqueness of Holocaust. But also, this is a clear examples of how these Holocaust memories had been cosmopolitanized in this century. But also, Leah David and Yelena Subotic showed very well how the Holocaust memory has worked as a screen memory in former Yugoslavia and in Eastern Europe to screen the other sort of crimes perpetrated by, for example, Serbian nationalists and Croatian nationalists. But also, Jan Grabowski, in the very long article in Haaretz in this year, criticized Andrea Virusung's way of the rendering responsibility of Holocaust solely to the Germans. Because according to Jan Grabowski, that way of German way of taking exclusive responsibility for the Holocaust, in a sense, screens or covers this the collaboration of complicity of East Europeans under the Nazi occupation. So this one is very complicated also. But also, we know that 2016 there was a controversy between Gross, Zaremba, and Smolar about the refugee question. Gross, in an interview with Die Welt in German paper, he explicitly said that the Polish indifference or antipathy towards the Syrian refugees in 2016 is related with the failure of coming to terms with the past of Holocaust. And both Zaremba and Smolar refuted Gross. Poland did not have a colonial history, so they had no experience in living with these non-European colonized. That's why Polish society was indifferent and something like that. But I think that this Zaremba and Smolar's refutation has a certain grain of truth, but also if we broaden the post-colonial perspective into the internal colonization, I think that Second Republic of Poland was also sort of a colonial state based on the internal colonization of minorities within Poland. So, I mean, nowadays we can see lots of examples how this Holocaust narrative and post-colonial narratives began to be reunited in the global memory space. And I want to suggest a critical relativization as an alternative term to the relativization which has been used to criticize historical strides in Germany in 1980s. So there are lots of examples, but I will skip all these examples. Okay, I will stop my talk here. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much, Professor Lim. It was really auto-reflective and very critical, and it was super interesting. I mean, how you are, how you see, how you reconsider the separation between a Holocaust narration and post-colonial narratives, and how Holocaust memory and Holocaust studies became some kind of reassuring narrative versus post-colonial narratives, which are somehow somewhere, not somehow somewhere, they are critical towards Western practices. And it was very optimistic that in the end you are looking for a reunion of these two narratives. And I think this is something what we really do need right now in our time. So thank you very much for that, because it brings hope. And it makes our studies meaningful. I mean, because we need this energy to reunion. So thank you very much, and I'm sure that there will be many questions, and also the commentary will be great. Thank you. I mean, personally, it's important for me, this reunion. Thank you very much. And now, thank you. And now the third presentation will be delivered by Danielle Lackstedt. Hello, Danielle.
Hello.
Hello, nice to have you here. Hello. Danielle Lackstedt is a sociology doctoral student at Stony Brook University in New York, so same place like Daniel Levy, Professor Daniel Levy. I know that you are also cooperating together, so I'm very happy that you are here. You received your Master in Human Rights from University College London and MA in Humanities and Social Field from New York University. Her research interests include the sociology of human rights and international law, what I find very personal, also important for me. And it's a pity, and I am a bit jealous to our commentator today that he is going to ask question for you. But I'm sure the discussion will be great, and we will stay in touch. With a specific focus on global norm diffusion and localized responses to the Holocaust in present-day legislations. Her current ongoing project examines primo, comparative genocide denial laws, and secondo, the memorization of the Holocaust in Germany and legacies of slavery in the United States as distinct attempts to come to terms with difficult past. So critical comparative perspective, kind of reunion, we can say. The title of your presentation, of Daniel's presentation, is Diffusion of Global Memory Norms on the Local Level, Implication for Poland and Beyond. Good luck, Daniel. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I'll look forward to keeping in touch as well. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in today to the wonderful conference organizers and my fellow panelists. My name is Danielle, and I am a second-year sociology PhD student at Stony Brook in New York. And I am presenting Diffusion of Global Memory Norms, Implications for Poland and Beyond today. So this is a work in progress toward what will be a chapter of my dissertation, and I welcome any comments that you may have. Just a quick overview of what I'll be discussing for these next few minutes. Mostly this is a chance to say that this will be a very brief overview, especially of the existing literatures that I'm synthesizing here. So I'll be happy, of course, to address any questions about these particular areas during the Q&A portion as well. My current research examines the diffusion or spreading of memory laws. So these are legislations that prohibit denial or the minimization of certain crimes, and especially the Holocaust. More specifically, I'm interested in the questions of how and why nation states adopt memory laws in the first place, and then once they do, whether the laws that exist tend to converge or deviate around global precedents concerning memory. There are about 24 legislations in the European Union and beyond, so my focus is the EU, and the central question overall is whether, again, the legislations that exist look exactly the same. Are they all completely different from each other? Do they share certain components in common? So in order to examine this question, I look first to the mechanisms of isomorphic diffusion, which I'll define in just a moment, and their application to a number of existing legislations to compare the language and sentiment of their English translations. And as for the global element of this project, I am interested specifically in the European Union's 2008 framework decision. This was an attempt to unify the diverse Holocaust denial bans that at that time. So moving into the literature piece to give a bit of background on each of these areas. First, in response to rapid globalization, international organizations have fostered a feeling, or at least the appearance of, so-called global norms. These are ideas or practices viewed as essential across national borders and in spite of cultural differences. And within this larger frame of global norms, I look specifically at human rights norms. These are a special case because they carry a particular pressure from the international community in that they are not up for debate, so to speak. They cannot be contested rationally. That said, human rights norms are often formed by particular events, and again, I'm focusing specifically on norms that derived from the Holocaust. And we know, thanks to Daniel Levy, who we heard from earlier today, particularly his work with Nathan Schneider in particular, on cosmopolitan memory, that memory of events differs by context. So when it comes to the norm of protecting memory, we expect to see such differences as well. The legal protection of certain historical truths, again, what I'm the umbrella term here, are a relatively recent phenomenon. So they do descend from the Holocaust, at least the version that we can today. But memory laws did not come about, there wasn't so much a boom in their existence until the mid-1980s, after which point a norm cascade occurred in terms of many national legislations following in quick succession to each other. So as a quick answer to the question of why states adopt global norms in the first place, John Meyer has this great summary statement that one achieves strong status as a rational actor by becoming much like everyone else. And the same applies in the international arena in terms of adherence to norms. As I mentioned, now over 20 countries in the European Union and otherwise have some form of legal provision prohibiting the denial of certain crimes. Some of them are specific to the Holocaust, others are in reference to crimes against humanity more generally. That in itself is an entire question for another time. And now getting into the crux of my argument here in terms of isomorphic diffusion. So you'll see, again, this falls in line with Professor Levy's categorization in threes. So I am a sociologist and giving you yet another example of this, but this framework is not my own. This was established by sociologists DiMaggio and Powell, it really came about in the context of organizational institutional sociology. So to briefly walk through each step here, these are different types of isomorphism. The first is mimetic, in which states other to determine the best next action, particularly in times of uncertainty. Then there is coercive isomorphism, which occurs in the context of a power imbalance. So this could be the literal imposition of policy, but it is in terms of softer pressure from powerful states. And finally, we have normative isomorphism. This is a play for legitimacy, such as when policy experts advocate new norms that are then widely adopted. So to summarize these types, policymakers often follow the lead of other states. Sometimes this is purely by choice, sometimes it's by force or pressure. And I expected to find all three of these at play in the diffusion of memory laws. Moving into some preliminary results here. So as I say, this is toward an existing chapter. These will become a little bit more fleshed out in revision stages. This is also not an exhaustive list of the legislations that exist, but I do want to point to a few key takeaways in this timeline here. The first is that norms must often rise to the level of global, rather than simply starting there. As we can see from this chart, memory laws specifically begin at the national level and then become enshrined by international bodies. So as we see here, the Council of Europe and the European Union. And in terms of the timeline, perhaps unsurprisingly, the first two nation states to legally enshrine prohibitions against Holocaust denial were Germany and Israel in 1985 and 1986, respectively. But Nikolai Kopasov writes that France's 1990 Gay-So Act is the classical memory law, that quotations set the standard for several international agreements and national laws, end quote. Of particular significance with the example of France is that it is the first to reference the International Military Tribunal. This is a nod that would be repeated by many legislations to come. And then, as you can see, by the mid-1990s, laws against negationism had risen to the level of a pan-European trend. Again, what I referred to as a norm cascade. And then in 2003, the first inter- or transnational precedent was set. The Council of Europe introduced the additional protocol to the Convention on Cybercrime. This specifically mandated the criminalization of acts of a racist and xenophobic nature committed through computer systems, including Holocaust denial. So I just misspoke and said that it mandated the criminalization, and it's very important that it did not mandate it. It was actually, in effect, an optional protocol. But despite this, a number of states enshrined laws that were in line with its contents, and you see those here in the early 2000s in the second column. And then the year 2008 marked a major turning point. This was the passage of the European Union's framework decision. And while some standard had been set by the Protocol on Cybercrime, the framework decision was the first to actually mandate criminalization without the right to abstain from the provision. So this came 7 years after the German-led commission first proposed it. Of course, any listeners who have worked or researched in the area of international law won't be shocked by this passage of time, in particular because this decision needed unanimous approval in order to pass. So this meant that a number of concessions were offered in order to facilitate the passing of this decision. Some saw this as watering it down to the point of rendering it toothless. Others still send a strong political signal in Europe. And you can see that another boom follows its passing in 2010, this list here. So what is clear, I hope, that memory laws and other globals might aspirate, set a tone for universal. However, national implements of these norms ensure that context will have an effect, and legislations like these, based on, for example, different actual commitments to the framework decision, and more generally speaking, because of different historical roles, respond to memory. Many English translators generally of their language. All of them, though, are nearly identical. And I find actually that most of them resemble the German model, with the addition nod to the International Tribunal. In addition to these similarities, though, a number of demand attention are highlighted here. I won't be reading through the provisions. For example, Israel, not listed here, is one of the pioneering legislations, as I mentioned. This is Kosovo's statement, quotation, not serve as a model for other countries because its language and motivation are so to the Israeli tradition. In addition, Austria's provision largely follows its neighbors. Consequences are particularly in comparison to, whereas provisions include a fine or imprisonment of 1 to 5 years maximum, Austria indicates imprisonment of up to 10 years or 20 for particularly dangerous cases. As I've mentioned, a number of exclusively reference Holocaust. Others refer to crimes against humanity or genocide more generally. This is a very important distinction. Nations have their own historical adhering to one or the other. For example, has experienced a number of failures to include the Armenian genocide in its provision, while others have succeeded outright in its inclusion. Finally, Luxembourg's 1997 law is almost verbatim to the Gay-So Act. However, it is the first to ban not only the denial of Nazi crimes, but also of other genocides in the same legislation. So this is the approach that became paradigmatic in the European Union, the legislations that followed, and it actually provides the structure for the 2008 framework decision that I've mentioned. So in addition to the chronological timeline, I created this image to show the relationship just described, because the example of Luxembourg shows that in addition to between-nation isomorphism, international legislations also borrow language from national provisions. So this provides evidence for a more multi-directional diffusion. In other words, norms do not simply flow from international or global to the national or local level, but the local also informs the global. And in summary, most of the adaptations that were made from those initial models, Germany and France in particular, and from the framework decision, could be categorized as what we call first-order changes. They're incremental, they still are true to the original paradigm. There are minor changes. However, third-order or fundamental changes begin to show in the provisions that stretch the limits of the paradigm to include not only additional crimes, but also more nationalistic orientations of their own. Okay, so turning now to Poland, because as you will see, its trajectory exemplifies more than one type of isomorphism at particular stages of its timeline. So first, 1998, it falls in line, so to speak, with neighboring countries in outlawing Holocaust denial during the initial 1990s wave. So this would be categorized as mimetic, probably also normative isomorphism. But in January of 2018, as many of you are aware or know very deeply, a measure toward, quotations, defending the good name of Poland, end quotation, the state introduced an addendum to its existing law against Holocaust that would penalize claims of Polish state complicity in the genocide. So this updated provision has been referred to as a U-turn toward the past, and it imposed a fine or imprisonment for a person who accused the Polish nation of collaborating with Nazi Germany. As mentioned during the brief literature review piece, conforming to norms is rooted in various kinds of social pressure, especially in the case that a nation is sensitive to its international image. So in this circumstance, there's no question that Poland's global reputation was on the line. And we know this because international response was swift and severe. Israel and the United States in particular made vocal contestations. And in March of 2018, just over 1 month after the announcement of this new legislation, the New York Times reported that the European Commission had threatened to strip Poland of voting rights due to its actions, which they labeled a threat to democratic norms. So this and other instances of international pressure ensured that a mere 4 months after the announcement of its addendum, international news shifted from publications of the original breaking news to broadcasting that Poland was walking back the criminalization aspect of its legislation. So in this circumstance, we see very clearly coercive isomorphism at play. In conclusion, when it comes to the adoption of these incontestable global norms, I argue that localization, or the adjusting of a global norm to fit local contexts, is allowed to a point. But third-order changes of this kind apparently stretch the paradigmatic limit past its breaking point. Poland's move signaled an abrupt departure from the existing memory law paradigm, and in so doing created a model of its own. In fact, as of January of this year, Lithuania is following that path, or a similar path for itself, as it began drafting legislation to prohibit claims of Lithuanian collaboration in the Holocaust. This following a meeting with Polish legislators over their, quote, common challenge, end quote, of historical memory. So overall, we see all three categories of isomorphism at play in the diffusion of memory laws. First, we see mimetic as a board. States look to each other, and especially to leaders in the area, Germany and France in particular, in the adoption of their own policy. We see normative in that nations were compelled to get on board with memory laws in order to maintain their legitimate standing in the European Union. And finally, coercive in the case of states like Poland, who pushed boundaries of the paradigm in an apparently unknown direction. More essentially, though, overall, I would say we see that in spite of the unquestionable pull of global human rights norms, they still do not lead to total homogeneity. This is perhaps unsurprising, but still an important finding because, as I have shown, we've seen differences across memory law provisions, language sentiment from a norm, but they nonetheless adhere to the specific context of the state. Serve as models for localizations, but also process of localization that contextualizes them to their immediate national setting. This research sheds light on the complicated narrative, excuse my dogs at my exact concluding time, This research sheds light on the complicated narrative surrounding domestic implementations of international norms, a site where conceptions of the universal or the global and the particular or the national often go head to head over the role of memory. And with that, I thank you so much again for your time and attention, and I will look forward to hearing from you either in the Q&A section or after the conference has ended. Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much, Dana. Thank you very much, and many greetings to your dog as well. It was super interesting because I could see, probably first time, the Polish case in the broader, wider methodological perspective, in a timeline perspective, in a chronological perspective, which is not political perspective, which is an academic perspective, a sociological perspective, via these isomorphic diffusions. And it was extremely, I think, interesting and yes, of course, and thought-provoking, because now you see that it somehow it touched not only Poland, but it's every state, almost every state in the European Union wrote, yes, to create or to redefine memory norms, and to observe it in the timeline is with some turning points, of course, a geopolitical turning and political turning points. It's really interesting. So thank you very, very much for this important presentation. Thank you very much. And now I would like to invite our fourth presenter, Agnieszka Wierzchowska. She will be our last presenter today, and after Agnieszka Wierzchowska's presentation, we will listen to commentary. Little bio. Agnieszka, hello. Good afternoon. Nice to have you here. Agnieszka, brother? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Great.
I used the microphone, but now I have it. Thank you.
Super. Great. Thank you very much, Agnieszka. Agnieszka Wierzchowska holds a PhD and is a postdoctoral researcher and teacher at the Institute for East European Studies at the Freie Universität in Berlin. She has written her PhD dissertation on the relation between Jews and non-Jews in Poland, 1918-1945, micro-histories from Tarnów. And I am so happy because it's once again, when during this conference, this micro-historical writing Holocaust story from below becoming a kind of important methodological point when we started from Omer Bartow and then Eva Kovac and Joanna Lehr and you. So thank you very much from this methodological approach in micro-perspectives. And her PhD was awarded by the jury with the Ambassador's Prize in the category Best Dissertation on Poland and German universities. She has published several articles on the topic, such as Beyond the Bystander, relation between Jews and Gentile Poles in the general government, as well as the Holocaust, helping, denouncing, and profiteering, a process-oriented approach to Jewish-Gentile relation in occupied Poland from a micro-historical perspective. In Holocaust Studies, it was published in 2017. And also, I know that what is very nice that we can follow you on your academic website, and your website is written down in European Network on Remember Solidarity Conference website. You can find the full biographies and also the link to Agnieszka's website. The title of Agnieszka Wierzchowska's presentation today is "The Holocaust in Poland: How to Research the Local in the increasingly globalized field of scholarship." And this is very important, current, on-the-map topic. So thank you very much for this idea, and the floor is yours. We are waiting for your presentation.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction and the organizers for. I don't see anything anymore, but can you hear me and can you see me?
I can hear you clearly, and I can see you as well.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Thank you. So, commemorating the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War on May 8th, 2020, the German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas and the head of the Institut für Zeitgeschichte, Andreas Wirsching, published an important text entitled "There Can Be No Politics Without History." And Professor Lim has briefly mentioned the Wirsching's thesis. The authors have stressed the global dimension of the Second World War and of the memory cultures after 1945. However, they emphatically underlined the sole responsibility of the Germans for the Holocaust. And here I quote from the text. The repeated attempt in recent months to rewrite history so disgracefully requires us to speak out loud and clear, and to leave no doubt whatsoever that Germany alone unleashed the Second World War by its invasion of Poland. And Germany alone is responsible for the crimes against humanity of the Holocaust. Those who sow doubt about this and thrust other countries into the role of perpetrator do injustice to the victims. They exploit history for their own ends and divide Europe. This passage must be understood in the context in which it was pronounced. Just a few months back, Vladimir Putin's statements on Poland's anti-Semitism and its co-responsibility for the Second World War stirred controversies at the end of 2019 and beginning of 2020. His article entitled Shared Responsibility to History and Our Future was later sent to the German scholars by the Russian embassy, who proposed to, and I quote from the email that we received, to use Vladimir Putin's article in the future when preparing historical contributions. In Germany, revisionist voices are becoming louder. Also, they entered the Bundestag with the AfD. So I guess both authors, Wersching and Maas, intended to refute such historical distortions and to strengthen the culture of self-criticism. Or as the authors phrased it, I quote again, self-criticism and self-confidence are mutually dependent, and this applies more to our country, that is to Germany, than to any other. About 1 month later, the Polish-Canadian historian Jan Grabowski published an opinion piece in Haaretz entitled Fueling a False History of the Holocaust Across Europe. And this was a reaction to Wersching and Maas. And now I will quote from Grabowski's text. The German scholars would have to broaden out their foundational definition of the perpetrators as German and only German. They would have to place at least some of the blame for the Shoah on the shoulders of the masses of non-German actors from nearly all the nations of occupied Europe who gladly, often without prodding and constrained Nazi Germany's genocidal actions. The willingness to appropriate all the blame for the Holocaust is noble, writes Grabowski. But in the case of the extermination of Europe's Jews, there is more than enough blame to go around. In the rush to assume the entire responsibility for the Holocaust, you deprive us Poles, as Hungarians, as Frenchmen, us members of so many other nations, of our own right and duty to own and to assume the blame for our own troubled and dramatic histories. Can you deny us, other Europeans, our right to confront with the past? So Grabowski proposes to broaden the term of the perpetrator and what goes along of what the Tätergeschichte is, and to include the non-German perpetrators in the picture. The German-Polish historian Grzegorz Rosoliński-Liebe argues along the same lines, and he pleads for more studies on collaboration. Although the term collaboration is a very contested one, what Rosoliński-Liebe proposes is to investigate more thoroughly into the agency and the scope of action of non-German perpetrators in occupied societies. In this talk, I would like to tell my experience as someone who was born in Poland, raised in Germany, and who wrote a doctorate on the Holocaust at university, and how I struggled with this double connection. I worked exactly in this tension between the German perspective and the perspective of critical Polish scholars with whom I was in ongoing discussions during my research. So in my PhD, I have studied the relations between Jews and non-Jews in Poland from a microhistorical perspective. And I focused on one town, Tarnów, which is in southeastern Poland. And prior to 1939, half of Tarnów's population was Jewish, whereas the other half were Roman Catholic Poles. The time that interested me were the 1920s and 30s, so the time of the Second Polish Republic, also the Second World War, the Shoah, and its aftermath until 1956. My leading question was to examine the social constellation and dynamics between Gentile Poles and Jews. Writing my PhD at a German university, I consciously wanted to show the realm of experiences, the social processes of the occupied society, the unequal victims, as Shmuel Krakowski and Israel Gutman phrased it. So, on the other hand, the occupied non-Jewish Poles, and on the other hand, the Jewish victims. And in the way, I distanced myself from the classic German Tätergeschichte. However, when I presented my research on the local Gentile population and their role in the Shoah, my German colleagues almost always asked, "But where are the Germans in your picture?" One of my colleagues stated at the workshop that we both participated in, what bothers him most in the newest Holocaust research in Poland is that the Germans tend to disappear in the narratives. This is also a critique that Grabowski had to face, and I remember a conference last year in Munich where Dieter Pohl criticized Grabowski for the same reason. In my research on Tarnów, I use the approach of microhistory. For example, to illustrate the so-called resettlement actions of 1942. The resettlements are, of course, a euphemism for mass killings of the local Jews. The Tarnów Jews were mostly deported from Tarnów to the extermination camp of Bełżec, but also a large number, and we're talking here about more than 4,000 Jews fell prey to the so-called örtliche Aussiedlung, an oxymoron that you could translate in English as the resettlement on the spot. One of the most macabre euphemisms in the Nazi jargon, as Christopher Browning wrote. That meant that Jews were murdered by the Germans on the streets of Tarnów and in the vicinities. Literally, Jews were killed in front of their non-Jewish neighbors. The Polish fire brigades had to clean the streets from the blood, and several Gentile Poles recount how blood was running down Tarnów's streets on the days of the Aktion. I also took a close look at the robbery of Jewish property remaining on the so-called Aryan side after the ghetto was established in 1942. Just to remind you of the numbers, half of the town was Jewish in early June 1942. That meant 30,000 Jews lived at that time in Tarnów. Then, within the next 5 months, 80% of Tarnów's Jews were killed, and the rest was confined to the ghetto. What happened to all their property of half of the town? To the belongings, apartments, carpets, clothes, workshops, and equipment? Although the most valuable things were stolen by the German occupiers, the local Poles had a share in the process of redistribution of Jewish property. That means mostly through robbery. I also examined the process of helping and what comes along with it, the omnipresent denunciations by local Gentile Poles. I analyzed such formations as the Polish Baudienst, which is largely a research lacuna, and the Baudienst participated in the so-called Aktionen by killing Jews with spades, axes, and other tools. My conclusion was clear. There could be no bystanders if half of the city was murdered within 5 months. The term of the bystander is a very intriguing one. It was coined by Roel Hilberg, as you probably all know. However, in my own research and other microhistorical studies that look very closely at the social processes in particular contexts, question the term increasingly. The more we know of how the Holocaust happened in specific localities, the more it becomes evident that the term bystander obscures more than it explains. The German term is translated into Zuschauer, onlooker, observer, viewer. But Zuschauer in German also means a public watching a play in a theater. Taking this metaphor serious, an image is implied in which the German perpetrators and their Jewish victims are on the scene of the crime, whereas the Zuschauer, the public, the onlookers, are somewhere outside, not part of the scene, they're not able to act. And I still think that this is still part of German history writing today. However, from my own research, I can state that such an image is a very distorted one. The local population was very much on the same scene, and they had to react. And in my dissertation, I'm talking about various types of reactions. But I conceptualized the non-Jewish local population as part of the social processes triggered by the exterminations of the Jews in their hometown, the exterminations conducted by the Germans, but with the help of the Polish Baudienst, the Polish police, and other individuals who denounced, robbed, or killed Jews themselves. When I presented my first results to my supervisor at my German university, focusing on the local Gentile population, my supervisor said at one point, you really cannot this way. So how to write a history of the Holocaust in Poland in a way to satisfy the German perspective and the Polish critical public? So I started to emphasize even more the presence of the Germans and the framework that they created, but it turned out to be more than just a rhetorical exercise. What helped me was to structure my narrative was the notion of occupied societies the way that Tatjana Tünsmeier conceptualized it, and what she also refers to Alf Lütke's image of the Kräftefeld, a field of forces. This field of forces is structured by diverse actors, but it is dynamic. It has the ability to change. In this field, we can situate different actors, the German occupiers, the local Gentile Polish population, and the Jews. Neither the occupiers nor the occupied appear here as a homogeneous entity, and you can carve out the power structures among the occupied, the unequal victims, as I mentioned in the beginning. You can also write about the Baudienst and the denouncers in this field without that the Germans disappear, and this field becomes something in which you can depict dependencies, constraints, terror, but also agency and Eigensinn of the actors. I think that microhistorical studies are especially useful for this approach, because concentrating on a limited event or a limited geographical space, we have the opportunity to examine a variety of sources. I have analyzed sources produced by the Germans, by non-Jewish Poles, and by Jews in Polish, German, and Yiddish in order to delve deeper into this realm of social processes. In this way, we can write an integrated history of the Holocaust, one that is very complex. But then, how does this complexity translate into public debates and speeches of politicians? I want to come back to my first problem discussed at the beginning, the debate between Grabowski and some of German historians. In the last decade, studies on the Holocaust have become a globalized and international field of research. We meet at international conferences such as this one with scholars from basically all over the world. Our research inquiries include vast geographical spaces, diverse national context. We can, and in a way we must, look at archives in various countries. And yet the question remains, do we still speak and write within a national framework? Is the Holocaust global in the way we perform it, but national in the way that we ask and answer our questions? And this is why we are surprised to find that sometimes we cannot agree. Or do we tend to address national audiences because we as scholars of the Holocaust are publicly engaged, and we mostly engage and care in the debates in the countries where we come from? In his post-war essay, My Żydzi Polscy, the Polish Jews, Julian Tuwim wrote, "I am a Pole because my hatred towards Polish fascists is much greater than my hatred to fascists of other nationalities." And I have to say that this is true for myself as well. We, scholars of the Holocaust, want to reach out to our respective audiences, these are the ones that we want to stir debates in, that we want to ask critical questions. Critical Polish Holocaust researchers acknowledge the role of the Jew empire, but their role is well known in Poland. What is controversial and heatedly debated is the role of the Gentile Poles during the Shoah. Hence, the prime interest goes in that direction. So is it just a matter of perspective, and it's enough to add more sentences about Germans in the text to make it more acceptable for others? I don't think it is that easy. After all, critical German historians reprimanding Polish researchers of not showcasing the Germans enough are arguing along the very same lines as nationalist Polish historians who attack critical Polish Holocaust researchers. Self-criticism was so important in the speech of Maas and Wersching as part of parcel of building a collective self-confidence. But in Poland, historians today pay a very high price for self-criticism. Instead, a narrative of Polish innocence becomes the mainstream. And in this narrative, the Germans, and only the Germans, are responsible for the Holocaust. Poles appear as bystanders at best, as passive onlookers, or more preferably as helpers. The number of rescuers is exaggerated. The irrefutable fact that helpers were afraid to be denounced by their Polish neighbors is swept under the rug. It is difficult to reduce complicity in a way that history isn't confounded, but we cannot allow to reduce complexity in a way that distorts historical truth, even for the most noble of reasons. I do believe that in this globalized field of research, we need a public debate, and a debate in Germany, a debate that would not allow to question the German master designs for the Holocaust, the German responsibility or blame. But as Grabowski puts it, there is more than enough blame to go around. Saul Friedlander wrote, "Not one social group, not one religious community, not one scholarly institution or professional association in Germany and throughout Europe declared its solidarity with the Jews. On the contrary, many social constituencies, many power groups were directly involved in the expropriation of the Jews and eager, be it out of greed, for the wholesale of disappearance." This European, maybe global dimension of complicity and anti-Semitism is precisely what we need to debate about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka. Thank you very much for this inspiring and thought-provoking speech. I would say even kind of statement, an academic statement, but also in the same moment, auto-ethnographical and auto-reflective, grounded in the fieldwork experience, but in the same moment, writing in your case in a wider, really high methodological approach which is so autocritical because it's asking the question, how to write, how to create a narration being between and betwixt. And I think that only from this perspective we can really start thinking critically. So I assume that your academic journey in Germany, it wasn't easy, but in the same moment it was very inspiring for yourself. And it's inspiring for us right now, because of course I heard this question when I was working for ERI, European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, and we had a meeting in Institute for Zeitgeschichte in Munich. Where is German perspective? And I remember first time I heard it, I couldn't believe. And then I realized that it's much more to explore and much more to learn. And I think that the job you are doing is just not only interesting, but it's necessary, it's crucial really to create this complexity and to not to stuck in this complexity, but also to find a way how to communicate beyond this complexity and find the proper canals and languages to audience and create a forum, create a common forum, not national one, but international one, or maybe starting from the subject more than from the national identity and religious identity. So thank you very much. And we were waiting for the commentary as well. And before I will welcome our commentator today, I just want to tell you that we do strongly recommend to visit our website because there are 2 more video presentations available on the website of the conference. And the first video presentation is by Janek Gryta from University of Bristol, The Limits of Cosmopolitan Memory. This is the title of the video presentation. The subtitle, Transnational Memory Work in Schindler's Factory in Krakow, Poland. Of course, the case studies is really interesting. It's a multi-directional space and quite important. So it's a really good video. So please welcome and kindly check it. And the next one, also very important, is Ximena Gueke. I hope that I'm trying to pronounce your surname, this Ximena, correctly, but I am not sure. Ximena is from Chile, exactly from Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, and she is really involved in the feministic movements and anti-racistic movement. And her title of her video, a very brave video, is Chilean Jewish Holocaust Survivors' Memoirs as Transnational Literature and Transgenerational Memory. So you are kindly invited to check our video presentation. And now it's a time to reflect on all of the presentations we have heard today. And we have a special guest, our commentator, Adam Kelpel-Fronius. Hello, Adam. Good afternoon, good evening. Nice to have you.
Good evening, almost.
Almost good evening. Nice to have you here. Adam, a little biographical statement. Our special guest today, Adam Kelpel-Fronius, was born in Budapest, Hungary, and studied in political science, modern history, and German literature in Freiburg, Wrocław, and then Freie Universität Berlin. He worked from the educational department of the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin since its opening in May 2005. Since 2009, he was the manager of the Foundation's project Information Portal to European Sites of Remembrance. I will try in German, Gedenkstätten-Portal, a website with information on well over 500 memorial sites dedicated to victims of National Socialism all over Europe are mentioned. It's very important, so please check it as well. He was the project manager of a bilateral German-Belarusian traveling exhibition titled Mały Troścień, History and Remembrance. Mr. Kelpel-Fronius is the editor of 3 autobiographies of Holocaust survivors from Eastern Europe. And also I would like to add that the institution Adam Kelpel-Fronius is represented, so the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin is the key partner for our conference. Same like Department of Sociology, Warsaw University. Thank you very much to your institution, because thanks to you we can really run this project this year under difficult circumstances, but we are really trying to do it as with engagement, the same engagement as we would meet in person. So thank you very much for all your engagement, and the floor is yours, and we're waiting for your commentary, Adam.
Thank you so much, Małgorzata. And yeah, it's a shame that we couldn't be in Warsaw together, because that would have been much, much nicer and would have had a totally different dynamics. But when we started organizing this conference, we had no idea what would come in 2020. So, well, we had exciting presentations, and it's been a long day, so I'll try to be short. And also, I have to say, after Agnieszka's presentation, I was almost inclined, because it was so thought-provoking, that it would have been a great, signal to go into the discussion immediately. But still, I would like to make commentary on all 4 of them, and thank you also for mentioning the video presentations, which you mentioned about the Schindler's Factory in Krakow and Holocaust survivors and their generational memories in Chile, which are also very, very exciting and touch on our theme, global and local levels, and their interplay very effectively. We have heard some fascinating takes on this subject from very, very different perspectives on the interplay between the global and the local levels of Holocaust memory. And for example, both Professor Lim and Josefina Honke looked at, in a very broad sense, and how the remembrance of the Holocaust is being used is a blueprint for memorialization of local traumata. I would like to start with Professor Lim's presentation, if that's all right. I have to say that was a real tour de force. It was a huge presentation. Well, tour de force across world regions and times and ages, and mentioning so many political actors and thinkers. So it was a huge undertaking. And if you allow me to say that, maybe it was almost a bit too broad a sense for such a short presentation. We would have had to probably talk about these things for hours, because you have mentioned so many subjects and so many different ages and so many different regions. But still, what is really striking is twofold. The memory of the Holocaust has been used as a blueprint or a template by activists when emphasizing the righteousness of their own struggles. So for me, that poses really two questions. In my observation, when we talk about the global memory of the Holocaust, we are inclined to think that maybe we are all thinking of the same thing, that we have a uniform memory of the Holocaust. So for example, if we say Auschwitz is being used as a symbol and is being understood as a symbol by us all in the same way. And probably that's not even the case. So maybe someone who, like in Japan, a Japanese nationalist, maybe who compares Hiroshima to Auschwitz, maybe they see a totally different aspect of what they think Auschwitz symbolizes, someone who is doing the same about a post-colonial struggle, for example. We could also shed a light on which aspects of the Holocaust are being actually remembered when they are being used as a blueprint. Second, and it came at the end of your presentation, is that you're also aware of the dangers of the relativization of the Holocaust. But at the same time, you still seem to be arguing that the Holocaust can indeed be used as a local context, and you try to advocate the use of the term critical relativization. So you gave us a very concise picture of the use of the Holocaust as a metaphor on the local level over the decades. And sometimes for us working in this field, it's really hard to bear comparisons like that. But it would be also very difficult to tell someone who is engaged in a struggle for sometimes very basic human rights, that to tell them that the use of the Holocaust is a metaphor was taboo because it is relativization. So they are the limits of that. And maybe, I don't know, maybe we could keep in mind that, or suggesting that maybe critical relativization is maybe not the, well, maybe it would be better to use the word critical comparison, maybe, instead of critical relativization. Maybe that would be more adequate for achieving the same goal. So I would like to hear your thoughts about that, Professor Lim, afterwards. Then we are going from the very broad to national level, and to Josefina Honka's presentation, which was extremely interesting for me as someone living in Germany for decades, and also living in these different fields of different memories. And she analyzes in her presentation, especially how German victims, especially survivors of bombing raids and such, in YouTube videos. So she points out that there very clearly that those amateur filmmakers are using the same methods when showing, trying to show authenticity, when they are showing witnesses, and they are. It's really over the decades, probably the presentation of Holocaust victims in documentaries has become very iconic. So with the use of how interviews and interviewees are being presented, how pictures, how atmospheres, music, film tools are being presented. So you say also in your paper, more than just a paradigm, I argue that it has become a universal symbol, a blueprint for other mediatized witnesses. And I completely agree with that point. On the other hand, to put it very bluntly and provocatively, what can we do about it? I mean, you point out the danger that the presentation of German victims can be used to negate victims of German aggression. But at the same time, there are only so many tools that a filmmaker has. So he's also cooking with water, as we would say in German. So you're bound to use somehow the same methods. So on the other hand, would that not mean that it is not appropriate to listen to the experiences of Germans who survived very traumatizing experiences and atrocities during the war at all? So I have to agree with you when you say that it's a really big danger that this victimization of Germans could be built up on purpose to negate German crimes or to calculate it against each other. But I would also like to ask Josefina if during your research, if you found also positive examples for a more ambivalent and not so black and white approach. So to talk about suffering of individual Germans without negating or trying to relativize what Germans have done to others during the war. So I would be really interested if there were also some positive ones. And one thing which was, that's not a point of critique, but it's something which came to my mind during your presentation, that of course these YouTube videos are being made by amateurs, but very often quite almost on a professional level. And sometimes if you compare those to what you see, what we have been being accustomed to in the last decades of how historical documentaries are being presented on German television, for example, in ZDF history and such, that's also almost on the same aesthetic level. So maybe you can share your thoughts about it too, of what you make out of how German documentaries on state television are presenting history. Now we have talked a lot about Holocaust relativization, which is a very, very fluid thing and very difficult to grasp. So let us go to the third presentation by Daniel Luckstead, because that was about Holocaust denial laws, which is by its very nature, we could anticipate that that would be much more easy to define, because from laws you are actually expecting that they are better better defined than other texts. So it is extremely interesting to listen to the genesis of these laws and who was the first, and then also the European Union's framework of 2008 and how almost all of the member countries of the European Union adopted some laws. But it was also very, very interesting to hear that on those different levels, the mimetic, the coercive, and the normative motivation behind bringing such laws. That was extremely interesting because it made me think of why these laws were made in the different countries in the first place. And also these laws, these laws are sometimes really severe. So as there are sometimes, if you are denying the Holocaust, there could be really severe consequences in some countries with jail up to a couple of years, which always is a big inherent conflict for liberal democracies, because in liberal democracies, we also like to respect the freedom of speech. So that's always a big conflict, and it's really interesting how you try to justify Holocaust denial laws. Just incidentally, yesterday, that's totally by accident, yesterday there was a decision made by the German Constitutional Court about freedom of speech, because one man talked to his colleague in a very, well, diminutive way, and the colleague was a dark-skinned colleague, and he imitated animal sounds when talking to him. But when there was a trial made against him, he said that it's his freedom of speech to do that. And the Constitutional Court ruled yesterday that racism cannot be covered by freedom of speech. So that was an interesting thing, which was decided yesterday by the German Constitutional Court. What I also found really fascinating about how you showed these relationships between a seemingly European norm and how global pressurized these countries to protect, to bring these kinds of laws. And what it made me think of was especially who is actually making the laws and what do they say about those countries, and who do they talk about when we look at the different laws, and how, for example, in Poland, it made its special law, special version of Holocaust denial law, and also Lithuania, as you mentioned. So maybe an observer would be inclined to think that it says a lot about the memory culture of those countries, how these laws are being written. But I would almost argue that it says not so much about the memorial culture, is about the parties and the political forces that write these laws. I think that's a very important distinction to make. And if I may say so, it made me think of another law from my home country, Hungary, which in 1993 made a law which basically banned the use of symbols of totalitarian states. That was a reaction to at the beginning of the 90s. There was almost everywhere in Europe a rise of neo-Nazi activists and a lot of skinheads, and most notably in 1992. Some skinheads using Nazi symbols tried to stop the president of the republic making a speech about the revolution of 1956, and the president himself was a very Arpad Gönc was a very important figure of that revolution of 1956. So he was stopped in his speech by neo-Nazis, and afterwards the conservative government made a law which made it prohibited to use the swastika, the Hungarian arrow cross, and the SS symbol. But he also banned at the same time the use of the red star and the hammer of sickle, so the communist symbols. Which was interesting because I had the feeling even then and today also that it had different addressees. You know, there was the signal to the outside world that we in Hungary do not tolerate Nazism, but at the same time it was also maybe a kind of gesture toward more nationalistic right-wing people for whom anti-communism was an extremely important part of their political identity. That, you know, there is an equation between communism and Nazism, and now we are banning those symbols too, which was used by no one basically at the time. So no relevant organization used hammer and sickle and red star in 1993. And one thing which hasn't been banned since is the so-called Arpad stripes, those red, white stripes, which arrow cross militia people wore in 1944-45 on their coats. They are still legal, as far as I know, but so everybody knows that it's associated with the arrow cross, but some nationalists are always saying, you know, this is an age-old, centuries-old Hungarian symbol, so you cannot ban that. So it's a complicated thing. So I would like to ask Danielle what she thinks, whether it reflects much more the intention of the lawmakers and not so much the state of very contested memorial cultures in these countries. Also, I have to say there's a difference. In Germany, you have a federal system, so when making laws, you're almost always making compromises. In the country, like there are some countries where a ruling party can basically make its laws on its own because they have only one chamber and they have a majority. So it is much easier for them to make laws without having to consult with other forces. And then I come to the fourth presentation by Agnieszka Wierzchowska. And I have to say that I have a personal stake in this because, as you said, I work for the Foundation Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, so the Holocaust Memorial. And if it wouldn't be for Corona, I would have probably met Agnieszka many times this year because we prepared, my closest colleagues prepared an exhibition which basically is concentrating on Tarnów, the city, the town which she wrote her dissertation about. That was an exhibition, German scientists from Vienna, anthropologists, and who were researching their pseudo-racist pseudoscience, made pictures of over 500 Jews in the Tarnów ghetto for scientific purposes. And these pictures have been found after the war. And that is the center of this exhibition, the base of this exhibition. And we try to reconstruct what was the situation like. And 25 of these people only survived the war. So that was the basic starting point of this exhibition. But as always in our exhibitions, we are trying to show the broader context, which was in this case to show Tarnów, and it was a huge as I understand, Agnieszka was a huge part and a huge invaluable asset to this exhibition, which has the title "The Cold Eye: Final Pictures of Jewish Families from the Tarnów Ghetto," and it is being shown in the Topography of Terror exhibition site, but unfortunately everything is closed. All the museums and all the memorial sites are closed, so it doesn't get as much attention as it should do. But since then, so we knew that Agnieszka has made incredible research on Tarnów from microhistorical perspective, which is extremely exciting because it allows us to. It was a great choice because it's not so huge as Warsaw or Krakow, and it's a town which very relevant town regionally, which had about 50,000 inhabitants. Half of them were Jewish, half of them were non-Jewish Poles, and she can really show from the point of view of these people how complex the relations were between Jewish inhabitants and Polish inhabitants on the other side, and their interactions in a city where about half of the inhabitants were Jewish. And also the urban landscape is very important because most of the Jews in Poland were living in cities, while most of non-Jewish Poles lived on the countryside. So the urban landscape was extremely interesting to show how this multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, the Second Republic of Poland, worked on a smaller level. And of course, it shows great insight into how the Holocaust folded out on the ground after the German occupiers came. And also, that's a very, very multi-perspective thing, because at the moment when the German occupiers arrive, that affects the life of everyone in the city, of Poles and Jews alike, in very, very different ways. But that means when the Germans are coming, it's not tabula rasa. So these relations live on, and people have very different motivations and do very different things in order to try to survive or try to even gain financially from the situation. But it also allows us to show, as Agnieszka also pointed out, agency of Jews. So one question I would have to her, to Agnieszka, is the use of words, because probably it's also problematic for her too, what to call the actors. Do you call them Jews and Poles, and why did you decide to call them this way or that way? Because it implies so many different categories. We can talk about religious categories or cultural, ethnic categories, but also we can talk about how important is citizenship. All these people were Polish citizens. So I would really be interested in how you came to call these different groups of people. But as we heard, her presentation didn't stop at the Tarnów example. It went on to be much more general, which was extremely exciting for me, starting with Heiko Maas and Wiersching's paper and their remarks, and the critique by Jan Grabowski. And I also followed the debate very, very closely. And I have to say that I had the same feelings as Agnieszka. So I was, I shared Jan Grabowski's unease when he reading the remarks of Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, but I also thought that his critique was also exaggerated in a way, and it was very polemic. And because it would be really false to say that in Germany there is absolutely no talk on the interplay between German occupiers and local helpers and perpetrators on the ground. I can definitely say from our experience at the Holocaust Memorial, it was opened in 2005, so 15 years ago, and it has a permanent exhibition, and it's been visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year, and whenever it's relevant and important, of course, local helpers who participated in mass shootings and killings are being mentioned in the exhibition. And there are scores of German scholars who have always tried to show the interplay between local helpers and the German occupiers. And I'm coming to the end, but also as a Hungarian, it's also, we have the same conflicts very, very often when talking about the Hungarian experience of the Holocaust or the Holocaust in Hungary. Because to put it simply, to put it simply, without the occupation of Hungary by the German Wehrmacht in March 1944, mass deportation of Jews wouldn't have happened anymore. So probably most Jews would have survived the war in Hungary. But also, on the other hand, without the active help from the Hungarian authorities, Hungarian state authorities, and local helpers, tens of thousands of them, it would have been logistically absolutely impossible to deport hundreds of thousands of Jews just in a few months. So one phenomenon would have not been thinkable without the other. It was the interplay between those two, the German occupiers on one side and Hungarian authorities helping them on the other side. And we have to, and if you don't take one into the account, then you don't understand the other, and you get a very, very distorted picture. That's very much the case in Hungary, because that's a very, very contested field of memory. So I think to sum it all up, we really have to talk much more with each other and learn from each other, and listen to each other. That would be the most important thing. And I have to say, in my personal experience, I'm quite optimistic. So that is definitely happening in circles, academic and scholarly and professional circles, that more and more people have a better understanding of local cultures, local languages. People like Agnieszka is a case in point. I mean, she speaks perfect German and perfect Polish, and also perfect English. So she can read all the relevant literature and can read all documents. And also, I think that she reads also Yiddish. So and she's not alone with that. More and more, I see more and more students in their mid-20s who learned Ukrainian or Polish or even Hungarian. I remember when 20 years ago I studied in Wrocław, it was very, very exotic to be someone without any Polish ancestry studying and learning Polish. And people looked at us in a very strange way. But nowadays, if I go to Poland and talk to museum directors, no one even asked me why I decided to speak Polish, because it has become also almost normal for them that people actually, foreigners, have learned Polish. So that means that things have really changed over the last 20 years or so. So I would also be interested to hear her view on that, if she also has the feeling that there is a dynamic moving in the direction that we are getting more and more intertwined with each other in these circles, and more expertise is coming up, which can connect the global to the local. So thank you very much, and I'm also very excited about the discussion.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you so much for wonderful, perceptive, well-aimed commentary. And dear all, we are on tight timeline, so we have to start immediately. So I would suggest that we are starting from the primary order. Professor Lim, Joseph Wichonkę, Daniel Lackstadt, Agnieszka Wierzchowska in the end. However, I mean, we had great questions and commentary from Adam, but also Professor Jackie Feldman. He has just sent us his question, and I'm guessing to whom it should be asked, but I think that first of all, there is a question to Agnieszka, because your name is written down here. So I am now reading a question from Professor Jackie Feldman, and please add it to the question which was already asked by Adam, and then you will try to answer both in one time. So question to Agnieszka from Jackie Feldman. Thank you, Agnieszka, for a very nuanced survey. I wonder about the performative role of knowledge, the selected positioning of academics. It is an accident that Grabowski's essay first appeared in an Israeli newspaper. The research you do, CITE, would create little controversy in an American university, but also arouse much less interest. Also, the information travel across borders very quickly. Do you give exactly the same presentation to German and Polish audience? This is a question from Professor Jackie Feldman. And there is another question, and I'm almost sure that it is going to Danielle. So Danielle, first is a little comment from Professor Jackie Feldman. It might be interesting to compare the correction and diffusion of Holocaust denial laws across European states with the diffusion of NGOs, in quotation mark, trauma therapy models. Two societies, especially in the global south, that resist them. And there is a question to this comment. Do you find legal prohibition effective in shaping collective memory, or does it make opposition a brave act of a minority resistance? Dieudonne in France, this is an example, but I am not, so I think that these two questions are going to you, Danielle. I hope so. Okay, so the floor is yours, and I would be super happy if you can give us perceptive answers, perceptive, in time. Professor Lim,
Yep.
yes, Professor Lim.
Thank you very much, Adam, for your very productive suggestion of critical comparison. To be honest, several words are popping up together. For example, juxtaposition, comparison, and relativization, and also the group of words: universality, particularity, singularity, and uniqueness. All these words are just revolving around this my very vague idea of how to articulate the situation of putting this singular genocide in the global context, which can be comparable. So I need to think of this again, but I think that under the umbrella of a critical comparison, we can see the critical juxtaposition and critical relativization. But I need to think over and over again about which one could be the proper term. But the other interesting example, you talk about this Grabowski and Agnieszka and Adam, you're talking about Grabowski and Virushin controversies and debates. But on the other way around, we can think of this exhibition of photos of Wehrmacht atrocities in the mid-90s. It was actually the final exhibition in New York City was canceled because one Polish historian, one Hungarian historian has interfered in that exhibition by pointing out these captions of those several photos were wrong, right? It's a sort of a petit faute. But this is very intriguing for me. No German historian, I think, could dare to point out this was wrong. But relatively a Hungarian and the Polish historian who were victimized by the Nazi Germany, rather freely or without any serious self-censorship, can tackle these questions. But also, it shows us that a certain transnational context of the certain historians' argument can be interpreted not nationally but transnationally. I mean, this under Virushin's position within Germany can be totally justified. But if that sort of argument of this about the sole exclusive responsibility of Germans for Holocaust is going abroad, going beyond the borders of Germany into Eastern Europe, in a sense, it can carry the different implications in understanding a Holocaust. So I mean that a transnationality of the receiving or perceiving certain argument that was produced within one national academia needs to be a very closely investigated and estimated, and also that we can find a way of really considering transnational aspects of these sort of arguments and debates. This is also can be one aspect of the critical relativization or critical comparison or critical juxtaposition. The other interesting thing is that we can see the similar phenomenon from the Japanese so-called conscientious historians or conscientious intellectuals, Yoshindeki Jishikijins. They are very reluctant to be critical of Korean nationalisms or Chinese nationalisms because they feel certain guilty of the Japanese atrocities has been perpetrated by the Japanese colonial rule or colonialists. But if we take this stance from the transnational perspective, in a sense, they can contribute to strengthening nationalisms in the neighboring countries like Korea and China, which actually, in a reversed way, strengthens Japanese nationalism as a sort of a weapon against the Korean and Chinese nationalism. So, I mean, this is really sophisticated effects or side effects of any argument or any remembrance culture of the past needs to be very closely watched and thought. Yeah, that's what I want to say. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lim. Adam, would you like to add something, or do you need a commentary to commentary? Would you like?
Well, I would like to thank Professor Lim for answering, but I would say, well, maybe it's better if you go on in the discussion,
Okay, thank you.
including the others. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. So I would kindly ask Joseph Honke to respond to the questions. Thank you.
Yes, and first of all, I would like to thank Mr. Kerpel-Fronius as well for his very, very thoughtful comment and great reading of my text and careful listening to my presentation. And I'm trying to be concise and starting directly with the first question that was, what can we do about it? And I would answer, first of all, do research about these videos, and this is what I'm trying to do, so we can acknowledge their existence. And then this is also tied to the second question of what should filmmakers do, because they only have so many tools. And maybe I would combine these two and say that our duty as researchers is also to make our findings available to the public. So we're talking about contextualization, integrated history, and we have the whole oral history debates about including questions into the interviews and all these things, but they seem so far away from what these filmmakers do. And so I would say maybe there should be a way of more dialogue between what we do at the universities and what is done outside in the public memory spheres. And then a very easy answer whether it's appropriate to listen to them. And I would say, yes, absolutely, it's appropriate and even important to listen to them, because if we wouldn't, we'd find a new taboo, which would then generate new discussions about, oh, this is taboo, we can't even say this, which is interesting because already I'm finding this in the comments, which I didn't include in this presentation at all. But for me, what is really, really helpful, and it's an image by Charlotte Delbo, and I like to use this for myself to keep in mind what I'm dealing with all these different types of victims and a universalization of victims on the other hand. And it's this image of being cold. So Charlotte Delbo is a survivor of Auschwitz, and she writes about this story where her neighbors in Paris are asking her, oh, is it even okay if we complain about being cold because you have experienced the Auschwitz cold? And she says, of course, you can complain about it, but we have to know that it's never going to be the same kind of coldness. And so I really like this image. Then I will quickly move on to the positive examples, whether there's some Germans that relate their experience or contextualize them. And unfortunately, I haven't found a good example. Hopefully yet, if someone finds one, I'd be very happy to include it. If it's talked about, it's very marginally and more along the lines, and that's why I also always include Welzer and his colleagues. It's more along the lines, davon haben wir nichts gewusst. So we didn't know anything about this. And maybe that's for a concise answer enough for now. Concerning the wide range of the amateurs, there's a wide range, of course. They look very, very professional a lot of times. But I would argue this is even more dangerous because viewers might question less of what is shown, what is narrated, what is told, if it looks so professional. And obviously, they are very, very much imitating documentaries on TV. You mentioned the ZDF history videos, and it's very much what we've seen in the 2000s. There's great research done by Frank Bösch, by Judith Kalbach, and maybe to keep it very concise, I want to just point out those two. And just say again that these are compilation documentaries. They also have easy narratives. They dramatize what is seen. They emotionalize what is said by witnesses. But I would say what they do more than the YouTube amateurs is that they try to include different voices, that they will maybe even have a British pilot also talking besides the victim of bombings. Maybe that very, very shortly. But thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Josephine. Thank you very much. We are going forward. Daniel, Agnieszka, because I want to reserve some time for you. So, Daniel, please go forward. We are waiting for yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I will race through points as quickly as possible. Adam, thank you just deeply. I can't say thank you enough, in particular for sharing your example from the Hungarian context, and in general, you've opened these fantastic new areas for me to explore. So first to say, to your point about freedom of speech always being a point of tension when talking about these legislations, of course, thank you for mentioning it. I kind of race around that and don't get into that in this particular approach, but I'm also sitting in the United States, kind of where that is at the forefront of at least part of why a lot of what's been written about the United States in terms of legislations like these is that it could never happen, in quotations, because freedom of speech is so heralded above all other freedoms. That sort of dialogue is always going on. And as for the particular question about laws being reflective of the maybe memory culture of the nation state, as in the state, as in political parties, instead of sort of greater national memory culture, I absolutely agree with that. I think that that's just a spot on observation that is very important to dig into. So I'm excited to be able to look into that in more detail. What I also don't have in the present research that plays into that is a measure of the public's sort of reaction to the laws that do exist. Are they largely supported? Do people think they shouldn't be in place? That's another interesting area. And again, going back to the United States context, just to answer that question in the affirmative again, I said unlikely the United States would have a memory law, but there is currently an executive order silencing critical race and gender theory, for example, which is very reflective of the current administration rather than maybe, or at least perhaps in addition to a greater memory culture that's resistant of certain conversations as well. So thank you so much for those excellent points. And now I'll move into, I believe it was Professor Feldman.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Her points about the diffusion of trauma therapy, if I heard that correctly, trauma therapy models in the global south.
I will tell you. Wait a second, Daniel. I mean, Professor Feldman, he wrote states with the diffusion of NGOs trauma therapy models. In quotation mark, to societies, especially in the global south, that resist them.
Exactly. So just one of many excellent approaches to kind of break out of the Eurocentric focus, which definitely is at play in terms of memory laws, mostly because in terms of contexts where they are most at play. But that's, again, another area for me to absolutely explore, not something I'm familiar with. And then the final question, also from Professor Feldman, about whether I find that Holocaust denial laws, for example, are effective in shaping collective memory, or do they sort of make the fringe who do, let's say, deny the Holocaust or minimize the Holocaust, speak out, seem like a brave sort of rebellion? I have a very unsatisfactory answer, which is yes and yes. I think it is both of those things at the same time. And of course, this is me giving an opinion statement rather than something. Of course, I could measure these, how effective are these laws in what they're attempting to accomplish. But I do think that they are effective in what I mentioned about the importance of sending a signal. They're sending a message of a position that is being held, especially by the European Union as a whole, to say that in this case, racism, bigotry are not acceptable and there will be consequences. That said, there has been research done on the individuals who, let's say, make it to high courts, Supreme Courts, the European Court of Human Rights, these high-profile cases, gives them a stage to sort of make their opinions and approaches public and inspire, in quotations, others to do the same. So I think that those two things are constantly in conflict. I would say, again, personally speaking, I think there is a place for memory laws to exist while also critically examining how do they actually work on the more local level in terms of people responding to them in that very important way that they may create additional areas of problems as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And now I would like to ask Agnieszka, kindly ask Agnieszka Wierzchowska for your commentary, response to the commentary and questions.
Yes, thank you, Adam, for your questions and insight. I'll try to be quick. For the terms, I'm using Jews and non-Jews in my presentation, but also in my PhD, because I sort of refuse to use opposition, Poles and Jews. I don't know. I have no feeling how it sounds in English, but in German and in Polish, Polacy, Żydzi, Polen und Juden sounds very excluding, because it defines Poles in opposition to. And although, of course, these terms have been used in the 20s and 30s in Poland in the time that I'm studying, but not only. I mean, this is a definition of the Poles, a definition by the National Democrats. Who is a Pole? It's clear that a Jew cannot be a Pole. So this exclusionist way of labeling groups, I don't think that we should reiterate it today when talking about groups. I think it's more important to ask what did being a Pole, being a Jew, mean for certain groups at certain times. And I think it's in a way also thought-provoking to use Jews as the ones who are to define the non-Jews in opposition to who is a Jew. It opens up new forms of asking how Jews identify themselves as Jews. As you very well said, is it a religion, an ethnic and cultural category that we use? And then we have people who are the non-Jews, those who don't belong to the Jewish group. I mean, I could go on and on this topic. I believe that saying Poles, just Poles without defining Gentile Poles, non-Jewish Poles, etc., defining Poles and the Jews as separate groups obfuscates in the way we think about the population in Poland. Jan Grabowski published his article in Haaretz because, as far as I know, no German newspaper wanted to print this article in Germany. I believe that he tried to publish it in a German newspaper, but he was turned down. And I think it's a pity, because I think we need this debate in Germany. As Professor Lim pointed out, this speech by Wersching and Maas has its has its legitimacy, so to speak, in Germany. We understand why they say what they said in the German context, but as soon as it leaves borders, it is being questioned. I think we must think about who is a perpetrator, about complicity in the way that it can leave borders. Professor Feldman asked if I'm saying the same things to a German audience and to a Polish audience. And of course I do. I think that the only difference is that the Polish audience or the German audience have different ways of, have different background knowledge about certain things. So that this is the only thing that I can add to clear the context or not. But yes, I'm trying to be readable for both audiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnieszka. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank you all, Daniel Levy, Professor Lim, Józef Ichonke, Daniel, Agnieszka, and of course Adam. And Adam, also thank you to your institution, to Holocaust Memorial. Really thanks to you. We can sit together and really discuss. And I know that I was pushing you a bit, but this is my role also to keep the timeline. But I want to tell you that tomorrow we can meet once again, because tomorrow at 3 p.m. Central European Time, we have the closing circle, the closing roundtable discussion. We are kindly invite you to also participate in active way. 3 p.m. The title will be Holocaust Memory and Research in the 21st century between the global and local. And who will be our guests? I'm going to tell you right now. Professor Dorota Głowacka, University of King's College, Halifax. Daniel Levy. I'm sorry, Dorota Głowacka cannot take part, but we are thinking about her. Daniel Levy, of course, our today's keynote speaker. Professor Jackie Feldman from Ben-Gurion University. Ewa Kovac, Vienna Wiesenthal Institute. Ewa Domańska, Adam Mickiewicz University. And the moderation will be held by Małgorzata Pakier from European Network Remember Solidarity. We are together the conventor of this conference, and I feel really honored and happy that I had this possibility to work with you all today. I think that I have a feeling that, like, in a lens we could have seen today the most crucial fundamental topic of our conference, being between global and local, the fundamental, but in the same moment, as we could see today, the most vulnerable. And thank you for that. Have a good night. Thank you for your attention, and see you tomorrow at 3 p.m. at our studio. Good night.